Picture this. It's 2009, and a scientist is hunched over a satellite image at a computer terminal in a laboratory somewhere in North Africa. The laboratory is alive with the hum of machinery, banks of monitors glowing softly in the ambient darkness, climate control systems maintaining the precise temperature needed for sensitive equipment, the faint beep of notifications from satellite feeds constantly streaming data from above. The walls are covered with printed satellite images, some marked with coloured pins and annotations, a visual record of months of analysis. There's a faint smell of coffee gone cold in forgotten cups, the unmistakable aroma of obsessive research. The scientist's eyes are tired, the kind of tired that comes from staring at screens for 12, 14, 16 hours at a stretch, searching for patterns that might not even exist. But on this particular screen, something unexpected appears. Strange geometric patterns, linear formations, shapes that are far too regular, far too organised to be anything natural. Dunes don't arrange themselves into perfect grids. Wind doesn't carve out symmetrical streets across 1,000 miles of emptiness. The scientist leans closer, adjusting the contrast with trembling hands, squinting at the pixelated shapes emerging from the digital noise. The image becomes clearer, and the patterns become unmistakable. Streets, actual streets, laid out with intentional design. The scientist's heart is pounding now, and calls over a colleague from across the laboratory. They stare together in silence, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the monitor as the realization settles over them like a blanket. Beneath the sand, hidden under millennia of dust and heat, something enormous had been buried. A city, or perhaps many cities. Perhaps an entire civilization that history had forgotten. For most of human history, we've imagined the Sahara as the dead heart of Africa, an endless, lifeless expanse where water is a myth and survival seems almost impossible. We've drawn it on maps as an impenetrable barrier, a place where civilizations went to disappear rather than flourish. Ancient trade routes cut across it, yes, but only because merchants had no choice, only because the promise of gold and ivory on the other side was worth risking death in the dunes. The Sahara has always felt eternal, unchanging, a monument to desolation. Travellers' tales speak of mirages, of sandstorms that appear from nowhere and vanish everything in their path, of temperatures so extreme that exposed skin can burn within minutes. The very word Sahara comes from the Arabic word Sar, meaning wilderness or desert, and for good reason. This is a place where the sun seems to burn with a personal vendetta, where the wind carries nothing but heat and grit, where a mistake can mean death. And we've accepted this as the natural state of things, the way the Sahara has always been. But that belief is wrong, profoundly wrong, and the evidence has been staring at us for thousands of years, painted on rocks in the middle of the most lifeless landscape on Earth. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a paradise. This period, known to scientists as the Green Sahara, or more formally as the African Humid Period, transformed this entire region into a sprawling landscape of grasslands, lakes, forests and rivers. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in what is now the middle of the Sahara, in a place where it hasn't rained in recorded history. But in this moment you're standing there 7,000 years ago. Around you stretches green savanna, tall grasses rippling in waves as the wind passes through them, the landscape broken by scattered acacia trees and denser groves of vegetation clustered around the remnants of water sources. The sky above is enormous and blue, punctuated by white clouds. Real clouds, the kind that bring rain, the kind you don't see in the modern Sahara except perhaps once in a decade. You can hear the sound of running water in the distance, the gurgling of a permanent river that flows year-round through this landscape. There are birds everywhere, their calls echoing across the savannah, the flash of coloured wings as they dart between trees. The grass beneath your feet is alive too, dense with insects, small mammals rustling through the blades, the entire ecosystem thrumming with activity. Feel the temperature here. It's hot, yes, but tempered by the movement of air, the presence of water moderating the extremes. Feel the humidity on your skin, the life in the atmosphere, and then listen, the sound of voices in the distance. Human voices, not desperate or frantic, but the normal sounds of a community going about its day. Imagine a sky that brings monsoon rains each season, that fills the landscape with life. Imagine rivers deep enough to navigate by boat, lakes stretching to the horizon, forests thick enough to provide shade and shelter. This wasn't a small change. This wasn't a temporary fluctuation in climate that lasted a few years. This was a fundamental transformation of the entire region, and it lasted for 6,000 years. 6,000 years of abundance in the world's most dangerous desert. 6,000 years where the Sahara was not a prison but a homeland. The question that drove early climate scientists crazy was simple but profound. How? How do you transform a desert into a fertile landscape? The answer involves the tilt of the Earth's axis, the precession of our planet's orbit, and something called orbital forcing. The idea that subtle changes in how we move around the Sun can dramatically shift climate patterns across entire continents. Between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Earth's axial tilt and orbital position was such that the monsoon belt that typically delivers rain to West Africa shifted north. Instead of bringing rains to a narrow band of territory, the monsoon swept far deeper into what we now call the Sahara. The shift wasn't sudden. It took centuries to fully establish. But once it took hold, it transformed everything. The science here is almost miraculous in its elegance. The slight tilt of our planet, the gentle wobble in our orbit around the Sun, had consequences that reverberated across an entire continent. Dust and sediment cores pulled from lake beds across the region confirm this story. These cores look like geological time machines, cylinders of earth pulled up from the bottom of ancient lakes, each layer representing a different period of climate and environmental conditions. When scientists examine these cores under microscopes, they're looking at the actual record of ancient climate patterns, written in sediment. Wet periods show up as different sediment colours, different chemical compositions. Dark layers indicate periods when organic material accumulated, when there were plants, animals, and decomposing life creating those darker tones. Lighter layers suggest drier periods, when the lake was shrinking or becoming more saline. They show us times when lakes existed where now there is only sand. Pollen grains preserved in these layers tell us what plants were growing, what kinds of vegetation characterized each period. And they show us something else, evidence of human habitation, thriving human habitation, in places we never expected to find it. The layers speak of agriculture, of fire use, of human modification of the landscape. They tell a story of a world transformed not just by climate, but by the deliberate actions of the people who lived there. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence comes from rock art. In the middle of the modern Sahara, where temperatures can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and water is so scarce that finding a well is a matter of life and death, there are caves and rock outcrops covered in ancient paintings. These aren't crude scratches or abstract symbols scrawled in haste. They're sophisticated, detailed depictions of animals and people, painted with a level of artistic skill that rivals some of the most famous rock art from anywhere on Earth. Some of the paintings are rendered in ochre, that deep reddish-brown pigment made from iron oxide, which was laboriously ground and mixed with fat or resin to create a paint that could adhere to rock. Others are rendered in charcoal black, the kind that comes from burned wood, applied with precision to capture fine details. The sophistication of these works suggests artists with real training, with years of experience, with a society that valued and supported artistic expression. The animals are crucial. Painted deep in the heart of the Sahara are hippos. Not small hippos, not distant ancestors of hippos, but massive, clearly recognizable hippopotamuses, rendered with anatomical accuracy that suggests the artist was painting from direct observation. The artists who created these images understood hippopotamus anatomy. They knew where the eyes sat on the head, how the barrel body was proportioned, how the stubby legs supported that enormous mass. The paintings capture details, the shape of the mouth, the texture of the hide, even the way hippos move. The hippos are rendered in deep blacks and browns, their bodies filled in with careful precision, sometimes surrounded by lines that suggest water or reeds. Crocodiles sprawl across rocks too, their mouths open in that characteristic alligator-like grin, their bodies rendered in vivid ochre and charcoal, their scales suggested through fine line work. Crocodiles don't live in deserts. They live in rivers and lakes in permanent bodies of water deep enough and cool enough to support them. The presence of these paintings is a time capsule, a message painted thousands of years ago that says, this place was not always dead. This place had water. This place had life. This place was home. But the rock art wasn't even the strangest part. Alongside the animals are depictions of people, not hunters in a sparse landscape, hunched over in survival, but people in abundance. There are scenes of gatherings, of what appear to be ceremonies or social events, with dozens of figures clustered together, suggesting celebrations or religious rituals or some kind of community assembly. There are paintings of people swimming, diving into water, their bodies rendered in graceful arcs that suggest the artist was chronicling leisure, not survival. Imagine the artist's perspective. They're in a time of abundance, painting their world as they experience it. Water is so common, so reliable, that they can dedicate time to making art about swimming, about the joy of diving into cool water. In one series of paintings in the Tamanrasset region, a site now in the middle of the absolute harshest part of the Sahara, you can see figures engaging in activities that would be impossible in today's desert. Wading through water up to their chests, diving with arms outstretched, their bodies caught in the middle of recreational movements. You can see evidence of watercraft too, boats or canoes rendered as simple lines and shapes but clearly intentional, clearly indicating navigation of bodies of water. These paintings are documentation. They're records left behind by people who wanted to preserve a moment in time, to say to whoever might find these rocks thousands of years later, "This was our world. We lived here. We had water. We had plenty. We had joy." The sophistication of these artistic expressions speaks to a society with time and resources for art, with aesthetic values and cultural traditions, with artists who were supported and valued enough to spend hours creating detailed paintings on rock faces. The scale of the water that once covered this region is almost impossible to grasp when you're standing in the modern Sahara. Ancient lake beds scar the landscape, dried basins that can stretch for hundreds of miles, their edges visible as subtle changes in vegetation or colour in satellite images. But one lake stands out even among these massive remnants of a wetter past. Lake Megachad. At its peak during the Green Sahara, Lake Megachad was the largest lake in Africa, larger than any single lake that exists in Africa today. To put this in perspective, it was roughly the size of the Caspian Sea, the largest enclosed body of water on Earth. Picture that, a lake the size of the Caspian Sea, sitting in what is now the heart of the Sahara Desert. It covered an area that stretched across what is now Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. An area larger than some modern countries, a single body of fresh water that dominated the landscape and climate of an entire region. The water was shallow in many places, only a few meters deep even at its centre, which meant the shoreline was incredibly extensive. Thousands of kilometers of coastline, all teeming with life. Imagine the ecosystems that thrived around those shores. Imagine the fish populations, the aquatic plants, the birds that would have been drawn to such a massive body of water in the middle of what is now a desert. The productivity would have been staggering. Fish would have been incredibly abundant. Not just one or two species, but diverse populations of catfish, tilapia, and countless other species adapted to freshwater systems. The lake would have supported hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and other large animals dependent on water. The shores would have been lined with reeds and rushes, with papyrus and water lilies, creating dense vegetation that provided both food and material for tools and construction. Imagine the human populations that could sustain themselves on these shores. Communities could fish using nets and hooks, catching enough to feed entire settlements. Farming was possible too. The sandy soils around the lake basin could be watered through simple irrigation, turning them into productive agricultural land. Herders could bring cattle, sheep, and goats to drink from the lake and graze on the surrounding grasslands. Permanent settlements could be built, cities could develop, civilizations could flourish. Imagine markets developing on the shores, boats navigating the shallow waters, trade networks forming. Imagine the cultural development, the religious traditions, the art and music and stories that would emerge from such abundance. And then it ended. The monsoon belt shifted south. The rains became less reliable, less frequent. By around 5,000 years ago, the Green Sahara was beginning to retreat. By 3,000 years ago, it was essentially gone. Lake Megachad shrank from a Caspian-sized body of water to a fraction of its former size. The process wasn't instantaneous catastrophe, but a slow, relentless decline. Over centuries, the lake level dropped. Water sources that had been permanent became seasonal. Rivers that had flowed year-round ran dry for parts of the year. Communities that had built their entire way of life around water abundance suddenly found themselves struggling. Grazing lands turned to sparse grassland. Cropland became marginal. The people who had built their entire civilization around the waters of Lake Megachad and the other Great Lakes of the Green Sahara were forced to adapt, to move, or to be abandoned to the dust. Some populations migrated south following the monsoon belt as it retreated toward West Africa. Some moved to oases and areas with more reliable water access. Some may have simply disappeared into history, their populations declining as resources became scarce, their settlements abandoned as communities relocated. It was one of the great demographic shifts in human history, not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow transformation that took centuries, changing the course of human civilization in Africa. The archaeological evidence for this once thriving world is scattered across the Sahara, waiting in the sand like a buried library. Some of the most remarkable discoveries have come from the Gobero site in Niger, a cemetery located in the middle of the modern desert, containing the burials of hundreds of people spanning thousands of years. When archaeologists first excavated Gobero, they uncovered something remarkable. These were not hasty, desperate burials made in times of want or plague. These were careful, intentional inhumations, conducted with ritual and respect. The bodies were buried with grave goods, pottery, tools, jewellery, ornaments, items that would have been valuable and were buried with the dead as markers of status, identity, or simply as expressions of affection and care. Children were buried with tenderness, their small bones arranged carefully, surrounded by objects that suggest deep emotional attachment and care. Someone placed these items in the grave. Someone took time to arrange these objects with intention. The pottery found with these burials shows sophisticated craftsmanship, complex decorative patterns, and evidence of specialized production. These pieces weren't crudely formed but refined, finished carefully, decorated with patterns that suggest artistic skill. These were made by artisans, people whose primary job was not survival, but creation. The society valued pottery enough to support specialized craftspeople, people whose only job was making beautiful and functional vessels. The tools are diverse. Fishing hooks made from bone, bent and shaped with precision. Hunting implements including arrows and spear points. Grinding stones for processing grain, worn smooth from repeated use. There is evidence everywhere of abundance, of a people not struggling at the edge of survival, but living with enough security to invest in art, in beauty, in ritual. The diversity of the grave goods speaks to economic specialization too. Some people made tools, some made pottery, some were hunters, some were farmers. Society had organized itself with enough efficiency and resource security that not everyone had to be directly involved in food production. The Gobero site reveals something else profound. The skeleton of a woman buried with her 2 children, one of whom appears to have been stillborn or died in infancy. Perhaps 5 or 6 years old, the other child lay beside her, their small bones carefully arranged in the grave. The woman's arms seem to curve around them, or at least that's the interpretation the archaeologists made. And it's hard not to feel the weight of that interpretation when you see the photographs. The care taken in this burial, the way the children are arranged next to her, the objects placed within the grave, the deliberate positioning of the bodies, speaks to something deeper than mere biological function. This was grief. This was a mother mourned, children recognized and honored. Someone, perhaps the father, perhaps a community, had felt such affection for this woman and these children that they arranged them with care, that they placed objects in the grave to accompany them into the afterlife, that they treated this burial as something sacred and significant. The stillborn child, never to have drawn breath in life, was still considered worthy of inclusion in the family burial, worthy of grave goods, worthy of honor. That speaks to cultural values about personhood, about the significance of potential, about family bonds that transcend whether someone lived days or decades. The fact that these burials were discovered in a place where it hasn't rained in centuries makes the moment almost overwhelming. The desert had claimed these people, had swallowed their world, had buried their cities under sand, and yet here they were, their bones speaking across 8,000 years, telling us that they mattered, that their lives were full, that they loved and were loved. The intimate snapshot preserved in that grave, a mother and 2 children, one who never lived, brought together in death with care and affection, is a human story that echoes across millennia. It's a story that has nothing to do with technology or civilization or power, and everything to do with the fundamental human experience of love and loss and family. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Whenever I'm working on a video at 3 in the morning, tired and half delirious, I'll scroll through the comments and see people listening from Tokyo, from London, from Sydney, from small towns I've never heard of, and I'm reminded that there's this global community of people seeking calm, seeking peace, seeking to be transported out of their immediate stress and into a quieter mental space. It's genuinely one of the most rewarding parts of what I do. Anyway, back to what they found beneath the sand. The demographic implications of Gabbero and the other archaeological evidence scattered across the Green Sahara region are staggering. Based on the distribution of these sites, the amount of material culture discovered, and the density of settlements that can be identified through satellite imagery and ground surveys, climate scientists and archaeologists estimate that the Sahara during its green period, at its peak, might have supported between 10 and 30 million people. 10 to 30 million. That's a massive range, and there's fierce debate among scholars about where in that range the actual number falls. But even the lower estimates are enormous. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire population of Europe during the Bronze Age. It's more people than lived in the continental United States before European contact. The Sahara, during these millennia, wasn't a peripheral region, a marginal landscape where people scratched out a living. It was a major population centre. It was a comparable demographic force to other significant regions of the ancient world. The kingdoms of Egypt at the time had perhaps 5 million people. The Indus Valley civilization had somewhere between 4 and 5 million. The Sahara, if these estimates are correct, had 2 to 6 times more people than either of these famous ancient civilizations, and yet it had been completely erased from history, forgotten, buried under sand and time. The skeletal evidence from Gabbero and other sites also reveals something about the health and diet of these populations. Analysis of bones and teeth shows that these people were generally well nourished, with physical indicators suggesting good childhood development and adequate nutrition. There's minimal evidence of malnutrition or prolonged periods of stress-induced stunting of growth. The teeth show patterns consistent with mixed diets, including both plant and animal foods, with some evidence of grain consumption, suggesting agriculture was part of the subsistence strategy, even during these early periods. The skeletons also show patterns of activity. Strong bones and muscles developed through regular physical labour and movement. These weren't sedentary people confined to settlements, but mobile people, people who travelled, who worked with their bodies, who moved across the landscape with regularity. The patterns of disease and injury tell us about social stability too. While there's evidence of interpersonal violence in some burials, healed fractures and injuries from conflict, the overall pattern suggests relatively stable societies without endemic warfare or extreme violence. Life was difficult, certainly, but it was not characterized by constant threat or chaos. What they found next changed everything. Because the more archaeologists dug, the more satellite imagery revealed, the clearer it became that these people weren't just scattered settlements or nomadic bands living off the landscape. The evidence suggested something far more complex. The evidence pointed to cities, real cities, with planning, with infrastructure, with dense concentrations of people who had organized themselves into sophisticated social structures. The rock art showed us they had water and animals. The Gabbero cemetery showed us they had ritual, art and community. The diversity of grave goods showed us they had specialization, trade and economic organization. But what was emerging in the deeper digs, in the layers beneath the sand, was evidence of something even more remarkable. It was evidence of people who had built something permanent, who had constructed something that could withstand time itself, even as the desert tried to claim and erase it. And that discovery would force us to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. These weren't primitive people making do at the edge of survival. These were sophisticated civilizations, with all the complexity and ambition that term implies, and their story, buried beneath the sand for thousands of years, was finally starting to be told. Now, let's take a step back and paint a picture of what the Sahara actually looked like during this green period. We need to close our eyes and imagine a world that seems almost impossible when you stand in the desert today. It's roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago, and the great expanse of sand that defines the Sahara as we know it doesn't exist yet. Instead, you're looking at something that the earliest Islamic scholars called the Green Sahara, and it's a place of breathtaking abundance that will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of Earth's most barren regions. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast grassland that stretches to the horizon. The soil beneath your feet is rich and dark, carpeted with hardy grasses that grow taller than your waist, and wildflowers in yellows and purples that sway gently in the breeze. Acacia trees dot the landscape, their umbrella-shaped canopies casting welcome shadows where animals rest during the heat of midday. Baobab trees rise like sentinels, their massive trunks storing water for the drier seasons, their leaves rustling high above. The air is warm, even hot during the day, but there's a breeze, a real moving breeze that carries the scent of water and vegetation, and the smell of rain that has just fallen or is about to fall. And water. Water is everywhere. Not scarce, not precious beyond measure, but present, accessible, part of the landscape. The transformation from the harsh desert you know today to this verdant world happened because of something fundamental about how our planet moves through space. The Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't fixed and unchanging, it wobbles. This wobbling motion is called the Milankovitch cycle, named after a Serbian mathematician named Milutin Milankovic, who first described it in the 1920s. Every few thousand years, the axis of Earth's tilt shifts slightly. Just a few degrees, but enough to matter. The shape of our orbit becomes slightly more or less elliptical. These small changes add up in profound ways. They alter how much solar radiation reaches different parts of the planet at different times of year. They shift wind patterns, they move rain systems, they reshape where moisture falls and where drought settles in. About 10,000 years ago, one of these orbital shifts pushed the West African monsoon, that massive weather system that brings rain to Africa each year, significantly northward. Instead of dumping all its moisture over the Gulf of Guinea and the forests of West Africa, the monsoon now extended far inland, reaching deep into what we call the Sahara. The rains came reliably. They fell at predictable times each year. The soil soaked them up. The grasses grew thick and tall. The trees flourished with new growth. And wherever there was vegetation and water, animals followed. It was a climate system as stable and predictable as any modern weather pattern. This wasn't a temporary occurrence or a fluke year or two of rain. The Green Sahara lasted for thousands of years, a genuine climate epoch, a real chapter in Earth's environmental history, as long-lasting and stable as the Sahara's current desert climate. Now let's imagine following the rivers that carve through this landscape. The Tamanrasset River system was one of the largest river networks in Africa, ranking among the greatest rivers of its time. It was a braided network of waterways that would seem like science fiction today, when you consider that nearly all traces of it now lie buried beneath sand, invisible except to radar that peers through the dunes and shows the ghost of ancient channels beneath the surface. Imagine following one of these rivers as it winds through the grasslands and winding valleys, its water flowing reliably through the seasons, its banks aligned with reeds and papyrus, the same plants that grew along the Nile. The vegetation grew thick at the water's edge, forming a corridor of green through the landscape. Fish dart through the clear water, some species that have long since vanished from this region. Along the shore, herds of hippopotamus rest in the shallows, their massive bodies mostly submerged, cooling themselves from the heat of the African sun. Some of them are solitary, others rest in family groups, their young nearby protected by the mothers. Crocodiles bask on rocks, their ancient eyes watching for prey, their scaled bodies perfectly adapted to this water-rich world. This wasn't a distant memory or a fantasy or something imagined from a few scattered bones. This is a real landscape that existed, supported by real ecology, real animals, real people who depended on these rivers and knew them intimately. Lakes formed in the basin areas where water accumulated, particularly in the northern reaches where the monsoon rains were strongest. Some of these lakes were quite large, not small watering holes that you might find today, but expansive bodies of water perhaps kilometers across, their surfaces catching and reflecting the light of the sun so that they glimmered across the landscape. Around these lakes, the density of life increased dramatically. Elephants came to drink, their massive grey bodies moving with surprising grace despite their size, their trunks reaching down into the water, Lions hunted across the grasslands, their roars carrying for miles across the plains. Giraffes stretched their long necks to browse on acacia leaves, their spotted patterns breaking up their forms against the landscape. Buffalo with their impressive horns, antelope of dozens of species, zebras with their striking stripes, countless other large and small creatures created an ecosystem as rich and diverse as anything you might find in modern-day sub-Saharan Africa. This was a land of megafauna and abundance, a place where the food web was complex and interconnected, where predator and prey maintained a balance that allowed both to thrive. And into this world came people. Not explorers or settlers arriving in a previously empty land, but people who were already there, living in the region, adapting to the changing conditions as they unfolded over generations. As the climate warmed and the rains came more reliably, the desert dwellers, who had been living in more marginal ways, surviving on hard-won water sources and scattered game, moving frequently to find resources, began to develop a new way of life. They became pastoralists. They began to herd cattle. This was transformative. It meant they could stay in one place longer. It meant they had food that came with them. It meant they could build communities and societies around herding practices. The shift from hunting and gathering to pastoralism was gradual, but it was profound. This is where the rock art becomes so important to understanding what life was actually like in the Green Sahara. Because unlike ruins or pottery or artifacts, rock art captures moments. Rock art shows us how people saw themselves and their world. Rock art preserves images of what mattered most, what people wanted to record, what they spent their time and energy creating. And the rock art of the Green Sahara is absolutely dominated by one thing: cattle. Thousands upon thousands of images of cattle, painted or carved into rock faces across the Sahara. If you want to understand the priorities and values of Green Sahara cultures, look at what they chose to paint. What they painted was cattle, again and again, in endless variation. This period is called the cattle period by archaeologists, and when you understand the rock art, you understand why. These paintings aren't simple or crude. They're sophisticated, detailed, and dynamic. Artists painted scenes of herding, people moving their cattle herds across the grasslands, sometimes with dogs helping to control the animals, the figures showing deliberate action and purpose. They painted scenes of milking, showing the intimate daily work of pastoral life in careful detail. Women milking cows, their postures and movements depicted with grace and accuracy. Men managing the herds, making decisions about where to move the animals next. Children present in many scenes, learning the skills they would need to survive and eventually maintain the herd themselves. They painted hunting scenes too, people with spears and bows pursuing hippos and crocodiles in the water, showing that hunting still supplemented the pastoral diet and remained an important part of survival strategy. But cattle are the central theme, the focus, the cultural obsession. You can see it in the sheer repetition. Cattle were wealth, cattle were security, cattle were identity. One of the most remarkable repositories of this art is Tassili Naja, a plateau in southeastern Algeria near the Libyan border. Tassili Naja sits about 1,500 meters above the surrounding landscape, a flat-topped mountain of sandstone that juts dramatically from what is now the Sahara floor. The name Tassili means the plateau of the canyons in the Tuareg language, and the plateau is indeed cut through with deep canyons that have been carved by water. Water that no longer flows there now, and its rock faces are covered with art. Over 15,000 rock paintings have been documented at Tassili Naja. Some estimates suggest there might be even more, with undiscovered paintings still remaining in remote canyons and overhangs. The paintings date across several thousand years, but the richest concentration is from the cattle period, roughly 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. These are images that were created when the plateau was green and watered, when the canyons ran with streams, when the landscape around Tassili was habitable and productive. If you've ever seen photographs of Tassili's art, you understand why it's so remarkable, and why it has captured the imagination of archaeologists and artists and dreamers for decades. The paintings aren't the crude stick figures you might imagine from the earliest art. They're expressive and detailed. The artists who created them understood perspective, shading, and composition. They understood how to depict movement and emotion in a way that speaks across 10,000 years. They painted people with grace and movement. One famous painting shows a figure with an elaborate headdress, adorned with jewellery and ornaments, perhaps a ceremonial leader or spiritual practitioner recognized in their community. The figure stands in a pose of authority and dignity. Another shows a line of women, their bodies curved and positioned with apparent intent. Perhaps a scene of celebration or ritual dancing, women gathered together for a moment of community and connection. The cattle themselves are painted with attention to musculature and form, showing the difference between a young calf and a full-grown cow, between a pregnant animal and one that has recently given birth. The artist understood their herds intimately and represented them with sophistication and care. Some paintings show cattle with complex patterns and colours, suggesting that herding communities may have recognised and valued different breeds or family lines within their herds. One painting that captures something essential about life in the Green Sahara shows people fishing. They stand in what appears to be water, holding fishing tools surrounded by fish depicted in the water around them. But more than that, the painting captures a moment of ease, of abundance, of leisure. This isn't desperation, it's people with enough to eat, enough water, enough food security to fish as recreation or as part of a balanced subsistence strategy that included hunting, pastoralism, and probably some plant gathering too. Other paintings show people swimming, their bodies fluid and joyful in the water, arms moving, legs extended, the sense of movement and freedom captured in pigment. Still others show what scholars believe are ritual scenes: dancing, gathering, celebration. Groups of figures positioned as if in movement, perhaps the faint trace of instruments or objects in their hands. These paintings depict a world of relative comfort, where the harsh survival struggle was not the constant daily fact of existence, where people had time for art and music and ritual. The sheer volume and diversity of the Tassili paintings tells us something important about the society that created them. These weren't scattered individual artworks created randomly by isolated artists. This was a systematic tradition of art making that persisted across centuries, generation after generation. Generations of artists created these images on the same rocks, sometimes painting over previous works, sometimes creating new scenes alongside ancient ones. There must have been knowledge transmission, ways of passing down artistic techniques and styles from experienced artists to younger apprentices. There were probably artists who were recognized and valued in their communities, people whose work was sought after and remembered. The commitment to creating these images, sometimes in places that required difficulty and planning to reach, sometimes on high rock faces that needed scaffolding or coordination to access, suggests that art was central to how these communities understood and expressed themselves. It was as important to them as spoken language and storytelling. And the beauty of this art is something that's worth pausing on, because in the modern world we sometimes forget that ancient peoples were just as capable of creating beauty as we are. They had the same aesthetic sensibilities. They noticed light and shadow. They appreciated elegance and form. These weren't crude representations created by hands that didn't understand composition. The Tassili artists were sophisticated visual thinkers. They understood how to depict movement and emotion. They used ochre, ranging from yellows to deep reds, and charcoal and other natural pigments to create images that have survived 10,000 years of sun and wind and time. The lines are confident. The compositions are thoughtful. The figures have personality. Stand in front of these images and you're not looking at something primitive. You're looking at art, genuine art, created by people who had aesthetic sensibilities and the skill to realize them. Some figures are depicted with elaborate hairstyles, perhaps braided or built up in specific styles that held meaning in their culture. Some wear jewellery that's carefully depicted, necklaces and bracelets and ornaments that speak to trade, status and artistic expression. The artist noticed these details. They preserved them in pigment. Now let's imagine what it would have been like to actually live in that world, to experience the Green Sahara not just as a historical fact but as a lived environment. Let's create a quiet moment in your mind, a moment of presence in that distant time. Imagine yourself at the edge of a vast grassland in the Green Sahara, 8,000 years ago, just before sunset. You might be a member of a pastoral community, someone who knows this landscape as home. Your feet know every water source within a day's walk. You know the herds by sight and sound. You know the rhythm of the seasons and when the rains come and when to move to fresh pasture. The sun is beginning to sink toward the horizon, and the quality of the light is changing. It's warm and golden, softer than the harsh white light of midday. The sky above is a gradient from blue to deeper blue to pale orange at the horizon. The heat of the day is beginning to release, but the air is still warm. The breeze that moves across the grassland carries the scent of earth and grass and water. Not far away, maybe a few hundred meters, you can see a lake, its surface catching the light of the sun, glimmering and shimmering as the light hits the water at an angle. Around you, the grassland extends in all directions, dotted with acacia trees whose shapes become darker, silhouettes against the brighter sky as the sun lowers. The grass moves with the breeze, creating waves of motion across the landscape, green upon green upon green. Your family's cattle are nearby. You can hear them lowing to each other, a sound that's almost musical, almost conversational. Some are already moving toward the water for their evening drink. A few calves run and play, the young animals still having energy despite the heat of the day. Your family members are visible through the landscape, some tending to the animals, some preparing for the evening, some already sitting in groups. In the distance you can see smoke from cooking fires, faint and blue against the golden light. As you stand there, listening to the sounds of the cattle and the breeze moving through the grass, you become aware of the birdsong. Not a few scattered birds, but layers of sound, different species calling to each other as they settle into the trees for the evening. Some songs are melodic and complex, others are simple and repeating. The birds are settling in, finding their roosting places as the day ends. The soundscape is rich and full, a tapestry of natural sounds that most people in the modern world rarely experience. Your feet feel the grass and the earth. If you're barefoot, as many in pastoral communities would have been, you feel the warmth of the soil, the slight moisture still in the earth from recent rains. If you're wearing simple sandals, you're still aware of the solid ground beneath you, the sensation of standing on living earth. Earth that supports grasses and trees and animals and people is grounding and calming. The light is growing softer still. The sun isn't far above the horizon now. The colours intensify. The orange becomes more vivid, the shadows longer and deeper. Your family gathers toward the water. There's the practical reason for this. The cattle need to drink before nightfall, and the water provides a focal point for community. But there's also something deeper about gathering at water as the light changes. It's almost ceremonial, this gathering as day transforms into night. You wade into the water, along with other family members and members of other families in the community. The water is cool against your skin, a relief from the heat of the day. It's clean enough to see into. You can see your own legs in the water, can see the fine sand and pebbles on the bottom. Small fish scatter away from your feet. The depth increases as you walk further in, knee-deep, waist-deep. The water supports your weight in a way the air doesn't. There's a freedom in movement through water, a lightness. Around you, other people are wading too. Children are playing, splashing each other, their laughter carrying across the water. Adults are bathing, washing the dust of the day from their skin. The herds are drinking, their long faces bent down to the water, their massive bodies creating reflections that shimmer and shift with their movements. The sun continues to sink. The colours intensify even further. The sky near the horizon becomes a deep amber and gold. The water reflects these colours, turning into a mirror of light. The grass catches the light too, glowing in the low-angle rays of the sun. The acacia trees are backlit, their shapes becoming increasingly dark silhouettes against the bright sky. The temperature continues to drop, very gradually, but noticeably. The warmth of the day is releasing into the atmosphere. If you were watching the horizon, you'd see the exact moment the sun touches it, a momentary flash of intense brightness before it begins to slide below the edge of the world. As you stand in the water, you become aware of a deeper quiet settling in. Not silence, there's still the sound of cattle, of people, of birdsong, but a quality of hush, as if the landscape itself is settling down. The breeze that was moving so noticeably earlier seems to calm slightly. There's an expectation in the air, a sense of transition, of the day completing itself. You might have eaten before coming to the water, or you might eat afterward. The food would be nourishing. Milk from the herds, perhaps some meat, perhaps grains that have been prepared. There would be enough. There would be no hunger. After eating, there might be time for talking, for sitting with your family, for listening to stories or songs. Someone might tell a story about the herds, about a hunt, about a journey taken to a different pasture. The oral tradition would be alive and vibrant, stories passing from generation to generation, knowledge embedded in narrative. As true darkness begins to settle in, the stars emerge. Not the sparse handful you might see from a city, but stars in such profusion that the night sky becomes almost overwhelming. The Milky Way is visible, not as a faint cloudy band, but as a distinct river of light across the darkness. Stars are bright enough to cast faint shadows. The stars are ancient, the same stars that humans have watched and wondered about forever. Looking up at them, you might feel a sense of connection to something vast and timeless. You might feel small beneath that sky, but also held by it, part of something larger than yourself. The night is warm, but not uncomfortably so. There would be the comfort of being among your family and community. There would be the security of knowing where the water is, where the good pasture is, where the dangers are. This is home. This is a place you know and trust. As you settle in for the night, perhaps by a fire that provides warmth and light and gathering space, you might hear the sounds of the night. Insects, distant animal calls, the wind in the trees. These sounds are familiar. They're part of the rhythm of life. There's no anxiety about them. There's an ease and an acceptance. This is what the Green Sahara was. Not a barren wasteland, not a harsh environment where survival was a constant struggle, but a land of relative abundance. A place where pastoral communities could thrive, where the herds could multiply, where water was available and food was secured, where life flourished in all its diversity. A place where people had time for art and ritual, for family and community, for watching sunsets and swimming in clear water. A place where the night sky was full of stars and the earth was green and the future seemed secure. This was the world that our ancient ancestors inhabited, the world that shaped them, the world they recorded in their rock art. And in the midst of this green abundance, something remarkable was happening. While the pastoralists were tending their herds and creating their art, swimming in lakes and gathering around fires, other groups were beginning something different. They were beginning to build settlements. They were beginning to farm. They were beginning to gather together in larger numbers. They were, in fact, building cities. And in the next section, we're going to meet these city builders and see what they created in the heart of the Green Sahara. As the Green Sahara began to dry and the climate shifted, something remarkable happened in what is now Libya. People didn't abandon this changing landscape. Instead, they adapted, they engineered, they built. Around 1000 BCE, a civilization emerged that would become one of ancient Africa's great mysteries, hidden for centuries beneath the sand and obscured by the prejudices of the classical world. This was the Garamante, and their story is one of ingenuity born from necessity, of solving one of humanity's most fundamental problems, how to survive where water should be impossible to find. The Garamantes didn't appear overnight as a fully formed civilization. Like all great societies, they developed gradually, their culture shaped by the environment they inhabited. But what made them unique was how they responded to the Sahara's aridity. Where others might have retreated or migrated, the Garamantes made the counterintuitive decision to build deeper. They would go beneath the desert itself to find what they needed. Their capital, Garama, emerged in the Fedzan region of southern Libya, in a vast desert depression where, at first glance, prosperity seemed impossible. Yet at its height, between roughly 500 BCE and 200 CE, Garama was a bustling city of perhaps 10,000 to 30,000 people, with stone buildings, organised streets, marketplaces, and defensive walls. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a proper urban centre, with distinct neighbourhoods and specialised craftspeople. Pottery workshops have been uncovered. Evidence of ironworking and metalcraft abounds. Merchants' quarters can be identified. The city had administrative buildings, shrines, and public spaces. The Garamantes weren't nomads or desert wanderers. They were city builders, and their achievement challenges everything we thought we knew about pre-Roman Africa. But what made Garama function was something beneath the city, invisible to the ancient world and nearly invisible to the modern eye until archaeologists and satellite imagery revealed its true extent. The Garamantes engineered what would become their most famous legacy, the Fagara system. The word comes from North African Arabic and means tunnel, but this undersells what these structures actually were. Fagaras were an intricate network of underground channels and tunnels, sometimes hundreds of miles in total length for a single system, that tapped into aquifers deep beneath the Sahara's surface. These were fossil water reserves, laid down millennia earlier when the climate was wetter, now locked beneath layers of sand and rock. To reach this water, the Garamantes didn't dig simple wells. Instead, they engineered horizontal tunnels, maintaining a slight downward slope to allow water to flow by gravity toward where it was needed. At intervals along these tunnels, they constructed vertical shafts, both for removing excavated material during construction and for maintaining the system later. These shafts also allowed air circulation in the tunnels, crucial for the workers who had to descend into the darkness. The scale of this engineering project is almost impossible to grasp. Over 600 individual Foggara systems have been identified in the region where the Garamantes flourished, and they extend for hundreds of miles in total. Some of the longest individual systems run for more than 50 kilometers underground, stretching across the desert where nothing visible on the surface indicates their presence. To put this in perspective, the Roman aqueducts, those famous feats of engineering that carried water across landscapes and brought water into cities like Rome, was certainly impressive. But the Garamantes Foggara systems were comparable in scope and complexity, achieving essentially the same goal through different means. The Romans built their aqueducts above ground, carrying water across the landscape for everyone to see and admire. The Garamantes did much the same thing, but they did it beneath the sand. Nobody would ever know. Nobody would see their work. Yet they built it anyway, with the same precision and the same engineering skill that the Romans would later apply to their own hydraulic projects. Imagine standing at the entrance to one of these tunnels in the pre-dawn darkness, the only sound the distant echo of water flowing through the underground channels. The air would be cool and stable, far cooler than the surface world where temperatures soared mercilessly. The darkness would be complete, relieved only by the small flame of an oil lamp or torch. Your footsteps would echo off the stone ceiling as you moved deeper into the earth, step by step, the light of the entrance falling away until you were surrounded entirely by cool, dark stone. The sound of flowing water would grow louder as you descended, that gentle, eternal sound of water moving through an underground stream. It was constant and unchanging, reliable in a way that the unpredictable surface world above could never be. The cool air would touch your skin, soothing after the brutal heat of the Saharan sun. There was something almost sacred about these spaces, these cathedral-like tunnels carved into the bedrock, where water from an incomprehensible past flowed toward an unknowable future. The air would smell of stone and earth and moisture, fresh and clean, untouched by the sun. Your breath would move easily in the cool darkness, and time would seem to move differently here, below the surface, where the turning of seasons and the passage of years felt less significant. This was not a place of hardship or desperation. This was a place of engineering, of human ingenuity in its purest form, and of the quiet triumph of bringing life to a seemingly lifeless place. The water that emerged from these tunnels transformed the landscape. Where there had been harsh, barren desert, the Garamantes created agricultural estates and farms. They grew wheat, barley, and other grain crops. They cultivated date palms, producing one of the Sahara's most precious foods. They grew grapes, figs, and olives. Crops that suggest not just survival agriculture, but agriculture for profit, agriculture that could sustain trade networks and supply distant markets. They raised livestock, particularly sheep, cattle, and camels. They created gardens and orchards in the middle of a desert that received almost no rainfall. The scale of the population supported by these agricultural systems suggests that the Foggara network wasn't simply keeping a small community alive, it was enabling genuine prosperity and growth. Estimates suggest the Garamantes kingdom at its height supported between 50,000 and 100,000 people, a significant population for any ancient state, let alone one located in the heart of the Sahara. These weren't people living on the edge of survival, eking out a precarious existence. Many of them were urban dwellers living in cities and towns. Many were craftspeople and traders, merchants and artisans. The prosperity created by the Foggara system allowed society to differentiate and develop in ways that only occur when people's basic needs are reliably met. The Garamantes built more than just one capital city. Archaeological surveys, increasingly aided by satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, have revealed the true extent of the Garamantes civilization. Hundreds of settlements have been identified across the Fezzan region and beyond. Some were large towns with defensive walls, clearly important administrative or trade centres. Others were smaller settlements, perhaps fortified estates or way stations on trade routes. Many had their own smaller-scale Foggara systems providing water locally. The landscape that emerges from archaeological study is not that of a single city dominating the region, but of a complex, sophisticated civilization with multiple centres of power and population. There were palatial residences where the Garamantes elite lived. There were temples and shrines suggesting a developed religious life. There were storage facilities where surplus grain was kept, indicating sophisticated systems of economic management and redistribution. Some settlements show evidence of having been destroyed violently, suggesting the Garamantes weren't always at peace, either with one another or with neighbouring peoples. Others show signs of gradual abandonment and decay, but the overall picture is of a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years, that at its peak was capable of constructing engineering projects of remarkable scale and sophistication. What makes the Garamante story particularly poignant is how they were remembered, or rather, how they were misremembered by the classical world. When Greek and Roman geographers and historians mentioned the peoples of the interior Sahara, they tended to dismiss them with contempt. The Garamantes in particular were often relegated to the category of barbarians, primitive nomads living in the desert's margins. This characterization says far more about the prejudices and limitations of the classical sources than it does about the actual Garamante civilization. The Romans and Greeks had a Mediterranean perspective, and peoples and places beyond their direct experience were often simplified and stereotyped. The Garamantes, after all, were never conquered by Rome, never brought into the Roman Empire, and never fully incorporated into the Mediterranean world that the classical authors knew and wrote about. Therefore, they were considered peripheral, uncivilized, other. Yet archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The Garamantes were sophisticated, urban, literate. They had a complex social hierarchy, with kings or rulers who wielded significant power. They participated in long-distance trade networks that connected them to the Mediterranean world, to Egypt, to the Red Sea trade routes, and to sub-Saharan Africa. They produced distinctive pottery and metalwork. They wrote in an alphabet, teeming, that was used across North Africa. The prejudices of classical authors obscured the reality of a truly advanced civilization. The modern revelation of the Garamantes' true sophistication has been largely due to the work of archaeologists like David Mattingly, who has spent decades excavating and surveying the Fezzan region, piecing together the extent and complexity of the civilization. But it has also been accelerated by technological advances that previous generations of archaeologists didn't possess. Satellite imagery allows researchers to identify patterns on the ground that would be invisible to someone walking across the landscape. The systematic arrangement of settlements, the visible remains of ancient roads and trade routes, the distinctive patterns of ancient field systems, all of these become apparent when viewed from above. Ground-penetrating radar has allowed archaeologists to see beneath the surface without excavating, identifying Fagara systems and underground structures without having to dig them up. Thermal imaging has revealed water flows invisible to the naked eye. These technologies have transformed our ability to study desert civilizations, revealing in just the past few decades more about the Garamantes than classical sources and early archaeology combined could tell us. It's as though an entire lost world is being slowly recovered, brought back to visibility and understanding after centuries of obscurity. But the Garamantes weren't even the only remarkable civilization that emerged in the Sahara and its margins, as the climate shifted and people adapted to a drier world. Far to the west, in what is now Mauritania, archaeologists have identified another urban complex that challenges our understanding of early African civilization. The Dar Tichit complex, named after the plateau where the main settlements are found, consists of multiple towns and villages built of stone, with carefully organised street layouts and evidence of significant populations. What makes Dar Tichit particularly remarkable is how old it is. The earliest settlements at Dar Tichit date to around 2000 BCE, making them among the oldest deliberately constructed urban settlements in West Africa, and contemporary with or predating many of the better-known civilizations of the Mediterranean world. The people of Dar Tichit, like the later Garamantes, adapted to increasing aridity by developing advanced agricultural and water management systems. They built terraces on the hillsides to slow water runoff and increase infiltration into the soil. They created elaborate systems of stone dams and reservoirs to capture and store water. They grew millet, sorghum, and other drought-resistant crops adapted to the Saharan environment. Some evidence suggests they may have practiced transhumance, seasonally moving livestock to follow grazing patterns, in a way that was both sophisticated and sustainable. The Dar-Tichit settlements show clear evidence of social hierarchy and organisation. Some buildings are larger and more substantially constructed, suggesting they were the residences or meeting places of the elite. Others are smaller and more numerous, suggesting they were homes of ordinary people. There are specialised structures that appear to have been used for storing grain and other resources, suggesting the kind of economic surplus and redistribution that characterises complex societies. The settlements are arranged with clear understanding of defensibility and water access, suggesting that people had thought carefully about where to place their towns and how to organise them. The presence of distinctive pottery, standardised tools, and other evidence of craft specialisation suggests economic complexity. Trade goods from distant regions have been found at Dar-Tichit, indicating that these Saharan communities weren't isolated, but were connected to broader regional trade networks. These civilizations, the Garamantes, the Dar-Tichit peoples, and others whose names we may never know, represent a different way of thinking about ancient African history. They show us that when classical sources spoke dismissively of barbarians and primitive peoples in the Saharan interior, they were often describing sophisticated, technologically advanced civilizations that had solved complex problems of survival and prosperity in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Garamantes with their Foggara systems achieved hydraulic engineering comparable to the Romans, yet did so without the benefit of stone above ground, without visible monuments, without the kind of publicity that Roman engineering received. The Dar-Tichit peoples built lasting stone cities at a time when most of their distant contemporaries were just beginning to experiment with urban life. These achievements weren't derived from or dependent on contact with the Mediterranean world. They were independent inventions, solutions to local problems using local knowledge and local resources. They remind us that innovation and sophistication aren't the exclusive property of any one region or culture. When people face challenges, they innovate. When they succeed, they build. And sometimes, they build so well and so secretly that their works survive for thousands of years, hidden beneath the sand, waiting for the right tools and the right questions to bring them back to light. As we rest now, imagine the slow passage of water through those ancient tunnels, the way it moved year after year, century after century, from the deep aquifers toward the surface. Picture the generations of farmers who tended the fields that water nourished, the merchants who traded in the cities it made possible, the engineers who maintained the complex systems that kept the civilization alive. Imagine the quiet persistence of human ingenuity, hidden beneath the desert, working in the darkness to bring life and prosperity to one of the world's harshest environments. The Garamantes didn't leave behind monuments as famous as the pyramids or the Roman aqueducts, but they left something perhaps more profound. They left proof that when faced with the impossible, human beings can find ways not merely to survive, but to thrive. And yet there's more to this story, deeper layers still beneath the surface. For the rise of the Garamantes and these other Saharan civilizations wasn't inevitable. It required specific conditions, specific choices, and specific circumstances. And understanding how and why these cities emerged requires us to look even deeper into the past, into the times when humans first began to perceive the Sahara not as a barrier or a wasteland, but as a landscape to be understood, mastered, and inhabited. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Everything we've discussed so far, the Garamantes, the Foggaras, the thriving settlements across the Sahara, would have remained hidden from the modern world if it weren't for a technological revolution that happened miles above the Earth. In the 1980s, a discovery was made that fundamentally changed how archaeologists understand the ancient Sahara. It didn't happen in a dusty excavation or in a library. It happened in space. NASA's shuttle, imaging radar known as SER, was launched in 1981 aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. It was designed to map the Earth's surface using radar waves that could penetrate cloud cover and, as scientists would soon discover, could do something almost magical with sand. Radar waves, you see, travel through certain materials differently than light does. They can pass through dry sand, almost as if the sand weren't there. This is the crucial moment we need to dwell on, because it's the moment when the hidden Sahara began to reveal itself. Scientists staring at their screens in control rooms suddenly saw something impossible. Beneath the featureless dunes that modern satellite imagery showed as blank beige emptiness, the radar was picking up what looked like roads, channels, riverbeds. The screens showed ghostly traces of landscape, geometric patterns that couldn't be natural, arranged with too much precision to be random. Researchers began asking each other, "Are we seeing what I think we're seeing?" The answer was yes. For the first time in human history, scientists could see the landscape beneath the Sahara's surface. They could see the ghosts of ancient rivers, channels that had flowed with water thousands of years ago, now buried under dozens of meters of sand, suddenly appeared on their screens like some kind of archaeological X-ray. These weren't theoretical channels. They were real, physical watercourses that had shaped human settlement patterns in the Sahara for millennia. The radar data showed interconnected river systems, ancient streams and tributaries that no living person had ever seen. Modern Libyans knew these areas as dead, empty desert. But the radar revealed that beneath their feet lay an entirely different world. A world with water, a world with life, a world that could have supported civilization on scales previously unimaginable. When scientists compared the radar imagery with ground surveys, they discovered something remarkable. These ancient river systems correlated precisely with the location of ancient settlements. The Garamantes hadn't just randomly chosen where to build. They had positioned their cities, their towns, their outposts directly over the groundwater aquifers that these ancient rivers had created. The radar wasn't just showing us ancient rivers. It was showing us the logic of an ancient civilization. It was showing us how they thought, where they knew water could be accessed, how they had engineered their entire society around invisible hydrological systems. This was a profound intellectual leap. Archaeologists realized they weren't just looking at a map of the Sahara. They were looking at a map of ancient knowledge. The Garamantes understood their environment so intimately, understood the hidden water system so completely, that they had built an entire empire on top of information that would take modern scientists' space-based radar to rediscover. Since that initial SIR discovery in the 1980s, satellite and radar technology has only become more sophisticated. Modern remote sensing satellites equipped with advanced imaging sensors can pick out details the size of a human on the Earth's surface. But more importantly for this story, they can detect subtle changes in terrain that reveal ancient structures. A slight depression in the ground that might have been a road, a faint discoloration in the soil that indicates an ancient settlement site. Shadows cast by structures only a few feet tall, revealed when satellites image at particular angles. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, shoots millions of laser pulses at the ground and creates three-dimensional maps accurate to within centimeters. When combined with satellite imagery and ground truthing by actual archaeologists, these technologies have revealed something almost unbelievable. The Sahara wasn't just home to scattered settlements. It was home to complex networks of settlements, roads, and agricultural fields, all of it connected, all of it thriving. The pattern that emerged from these satellite maps was intricate and systematic. Researchers began to trace what they called the Libyan Desert Corridor, a network of ancient trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. This wasn't a single road. It was more like a web of pathways, some wider and more well-travelled than others, all flowing through the heart of the Sahara. The existence of such a corridor shouldn't have been surprising once people started looking. Of course, ancient peoples would create routes connecting wealthy sub-Saharan regions with the Mediterranean markets. But the scale of it was almost shocking. And the diversity of what was traded across these routes tells an extraordinary story about just how interconnected the ancient world was. Gold was the most valuable commodity without question. The West African gold fields, regions of what is now Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ghana, contained some of the richest gold deposits accessible to ancient peoples. This gold didn't stay in Africa. It flowed northward through the Sahara, across these desert corridors and into the Mediterranean world. Medieval Arab geographers later wrote that as much as 1,000 tons of gold moved across the trans-Saharan routes over centuries. 1,000 tons, enough to transform economies, enough to reshape political systems, enough to fund armies and buy influence across Europe and the Middle East. But it wasn't only gold. The trade routes carried ivory, harvested from the great herds that once roamed sub-Saharan Africa. They carried animal hides and furs. They carried cola nuts, valuable stimulants that came from forests in West Africa and were traded all the way to the Mediterranean. They carried salt, mined from inland salt deposits, and worth its weight in gold in some markets. And the trade wasn't one-directional. Roman glassware, ceramics, and metalwork moved southward down the same routes. Textiles from Egypt and the Mediterranean world were traded for sub-Saharan resources. Bronze tools and weapons moved into Africa. It was a true exchange network, not colonization or exploitation, but genuine trade between distant regions. The scale of this commerce is visible in the archaeological record. Pottery styles from across the Sahara show evidence of interaction. A style distinctive to settlements around Lake Chad appears in sites 1,000 kilometers to the north. Roman ceramics show up in inland African settlements. West African gold appears in Mediterranean hoards. This wasn't accident or coincidence. This was a deliberate, organized, sustained network of exchange. Archaeological surveys informed by satellite data found evidence that this corridor had been actively used for thousands of years. The trails themselves show up clearly in satellite imagery. Slightly compacted earth that has endured millennia of foot traffic, occasional wagon tracks, the faint impressions left by countless people and animals moving in the same direction. Pottery shards along the routes match styles from both ends of the corridor. Trade goods appeared in settlements far from their source. It was clear that long-distance commerce wasn't some occasional adventure undertaken by brave merchants. It was routine. It was organized. It was a backbone of Saharan economy. The infrastructure developed to support this trade was remarkable. Way stations appeared at regular intervals, places where caravans could rest, exchange goods, and gather information about conditions ahead. Some of these way stations were large enough to warrant their own water sources, their own storage facilities, their own defensive structures. In some cases, what had started as a simple trading post evolved into a significant settlement. Trading families would establish themselves at these locations, becoming wealthy through their monopoly on the north-south exchange. Perhaps nowhere was this network more evident than in what researchers now call Wadi al-Hayah, the Valley of Life, located in Libya. The name is fitting because satellite surveys of this region revealed hundreds of Garamantes settlements that had never been documented before. Hundreds, not dozens, not even 50 or 60. Hundreds of sites arranged across the landscape in ways that made sense only when you could see them from above. The settlements clustered near the wadis, the dry riverbeds, in patterns that suggested careful planning and water management. Smaller settlements surrounded larger population centres. Roads connected them all in a hierarchy of importance and traffic. Larger settlements positioned at the main junctions of the desert roads. Smaller way stations positioned at regular intervals. Markets hubs and administrative centres occupying the most defensible positions. And beyond the settlements, in the slightly lower-lying areas that today appear as nothing but rocky plateau, satellite imagery revealed field systems, agricultural plots, thousands of them, some of them still showing the faint remains of boundary walls, rows where crops had been planted, terracing on slopes to manage water runoff. This was a landscape engineered for human habitation, every part of it designed to extract maximum benefit from a precious resource, water. The Garamantes didn't just settle Wadi al-Hayah, they transformed it. They created an agropastoral landscape that could support substantial population densities. There's evidence that these settlements engaged in multiple forms of subsistence. Date palm cultivation in the lower areas, where water was more available. Grain farming, wheat and barley, in areas where seasonal moisture allowed it. Pastoral activities, herding goats, sheep, and camels, in the wider spaces between settlements where animals could graze. This diversification meant they weren't vulnerable to a single crop failure or a single environmental fluctuation. The scale of these settlements, when you could see them from above, changed how archaeologists understood Saharan population density. Estimates of the medieval trans-Saharan trade had suggested relatively small numbers of traders, maybe thousands moving goods annually. But if this area alone contained hundreds of settlements, if the entire Libyan desert contained thousands of sites, then the population moving goods had to be far larger. Tens of thousands of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands living in Saharan settlements. The Garamantes were more than a cultural group. They were an empire in the truest sense, a complex society that could support hundreds of settlements, organize their defense, coordinate their water management, and facilitate long-distance trade. All of this was visible only when you could escape the dust and look down on it from above. The political implications are staggering. An empire that invisible to ground-level observation, an empire that could only be known through space-age technology, an empire that had lasted for centuries until climate change, not invasion, had ended it. Water remained the central organizing principle of all these settlements, and the most significant source of water in the ancient Sahara, beyond the underground aquifers that the Fogaras tapped, was Lake Megachad. This wasn't just any lake. At its peak, around 5,000 years ago, Lake Megachad covered roughly 150,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the combined area of all 5 of the Great Lakes. It was, in short, an inland sea. The lake's surface covered an area equivalent to present-day Florida. It had depths in some areas of up to 1,000 feet. Its shores stretched for thousands of kilometers. Today, Lake Chad exists as a shadow of itself. The satellite photos that revealed the Garamante settlements also revealed something heartbreaking when compared to older data. Lake Chad is now less than 1/10 of its historical size. What happened? The climate of the Sahara changed. The monsoon rains that had fed the lake shifted their patterns. Over centuries, the lake shrank. Settlements that had thrived on its shores were abandoned. The question is, what was it like when the lake was vast? Imagine standing on the shore of this enormous body of water in the year 3000 BCE. The water stretches to the horizon. It's fresh water, fed by rainfall from the monsoons and by numerous rivers that flowed from highlands in Niger, Nigeria, and Chad. The water is warm and full of fish. Along the shores, fishing communities have built settlements. Some are just temporary camps where fishermen stay during the season. Others are more permanent, with houses and storage facilities for dried fish that would be traded across the Sahara. The fishing technology was sophisticated. Archaeological evidence suggests the use of nets, traps, and hooks made from bone and stone. Fish were dried and salted for preservation. Fish oils were rendered for cooking and for trading. Shells from fish and mollusks found their way into jewellery and decorative objects. Fish teeth and bones were fashioned into tools. The lake's resources were exploited with systematic efficiency. On the water itself, boats move. They carry traders and goods. Islands dot the lake, some large enough to support small settlements. These islands provided defence from land-based raiders, and they also provided excellent fishing grounds. The islands themselves are archaeologically significant, because isolation creates different evolutionary and settlement patterns, but most of them are underwater now. Some scholars estimate that the largest islands in Megachad supported populations of several hundred people each. They developed distinct cultural practices, distinct pottery styles, distinct trade relationships with mainland populations. These island communities were crucial to the lake economy. They controlled fishing grounds. They controlled access to certain resources. They served as neutral trading zones where merchants from different regions could meet safely. The trade routes across Megachad connected the regions south of the Sahara, gold-rich West Africa, with the Mediterranean world. But the lake itself was a destination, not just a through point. The fish resources attracted traders from across the Sahara. The salt pans on the lake's edges were important sources of salt. The lake itself was a highway for movement. Boats could carry far more cargo more efficiently than overland caravans. Imagine the scene at one of the major fishing settlements when a trading boat arrived from the north, merchants from the Mediterranean, traders carrying goods from Egypt, from Phoenician cities, from Greek trading posts. They came seeking fish. They came seeking hippo ivory from the lake's massive hippo populations. They came seeking access to sub-Saharan goods like gold and animal hides that could be procured through intermediaries who worked the lake. The settlement would transform when a boat arrived. Prices would shift. New goods would appear. Information from the outside world would be shared. These lakeside settlements became centres of information exchange. Traders brought news. Merchants brought cultural practices. Smiths brought metalworking techniques. Priests brought religious ideas. Lake Megachad was a crucible where African, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern cultures mixed and exchanged ideas. This wasn't a small amount of gold. Medieval accounts suggest that as much as 1,000 tons of gold flowed across these routes over the centuries. Gold that would shape economies, buy weapons, purchase influence, and alter the course of history. All of this flowed through or beside Lake Megachad. Vast caravans carrying this wealth moved along the lake's shores. Entire economies depended on the lake's productivity. Merchants grew wealthy from trade in lake resources. Kings and rulers built their power on the foundation of lake-based commerce. The decline of the lake is one of the great traumas in Saharan history. It happened gradually over centuries, invisible to any individual living through it, but cumulatively catastrophic. The monsoon rains gradually shifted. The inflow rivers dried up or reduced their flow. The lake level dropped year after year, decade after decade. Settlements that had stood on the shoreline found themselves stranded inland. Fishing communities watched their resource disappear. Trading networks that depended on boat access fragmented as water levels became too shallow for boats. As it shrank, the networks that depended on it fractured. Trade routes became harder to maintain. Settlements were abandoned. Refugees moved. Populations that had depended entirely on the lake's resources had to adapt, move, or die. The Garamantes culture eventually collapsed, not invaded by outsiders but undone by environmental change. And yet, even though most of Lake Megachad is now gone, its legacy remains visible in the satellite imagery, in the remnants of settlements, in the fish bones that archaeologists still find at ancient sites, in the historical records that mention this enormous body of water. The satellite data shows the ancient shorelines, multiple distinct lines marking where the lake's edge had been at different periods of time. Geologists and hydrologists have used this data to reconstruct the lake's history over millennia. They can see the peaks and valleys in its size, the periods of expansion and contraction. The modern world had forgotten about it, dismissed it as exaggeration or legend. Medieval Arab scholars wrote about the vast waters of ancient Lake Chad, but European geographers dismissed these accounts as fantasy. How could an enormous lake exist in the heart of the Sahara? It seemed impossible, but the satellites saw it. The radar found the evidence. Water shaped the Sahara, and when the water went away, so did the civilizations that had depended on it. But there's another story hidden beneath the Sahara sand, one that goes back even further in time, before the Garamantes, before Megachad, before the first Egyptian dynasties. A story about astronomy, about human ambition, about the fundamental human desire to understand the cosmos. In Egypt's western desert, in a place called Nabta Playa, lies one of the world's oldest astronomical observatories, not a building, but a ceremonial site, and a landscape that was engineered and positioned with such precision that it could only have been designed by people with sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Nabta Playa dates to roughly 7,000 to 6,500 BCE. That's 10,000 years ago. That's before the pyramids. That's before the first dynasties of Egypt. That's before writing. It's before agriculture was well established in the Nile Valley. And at Nabta Playa, in the middle of the desert, someone placed stones in circles. These circles were aligned with the stars. Specifically, they aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. But more remarkably, one of the stone alignments, a line of 6 stones, points directly to where Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, would have risen on the day of the summer solstice around 6,700 BCE. Sirius is the star that would later dominate Egyptian astronomy. The Egyptian calendar would eventually be calibrated to the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when the star becomes visible again after its period of being hidden by the sun's glare. The flooding of the Nile was synchronized with the rising of Sirius. Religious ceremonies were timed to it. But here, at Nabta Playa, thousands of years before pharaonic Egypt existed, people were already tracking Sirius, already building monuments aligned to its movements, already organizing their calendar and ceremonies around its appearance. This is not coincidence. This is not accident. This is intentional astronomical observation built into the landscape itself. Imagine what it took to create these alignments. You need sophisticated knowledge of the night sky. You need to observe for years or decades to establish precise patterns. You need to understand the precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of stars to shift over centuries. You need mathematics to calculate where a star will rise at a particular date. You need organizational ability to gather the stone, to position it precisely, to maintain it across generations. This wasn't the work of a single individual or a single year. This was a project that required sustained effort, accumulated knowledge, and cultural continuity. The stone circles at Nabta Playa are arranged in a way that suggests they required regular maintenance and adjustment. The site appears to have been a gathering place, perhaps for ceremonies marking the solstices and equinoxes, perhaps for the observation and coordination of calendar making, perhaps for religious rituals tied to the cycles of the stars. Pottery found at the site suggests repeated use over centuries. Bone tools suggest the preparation of food, suggesting that people stayed at the site for periods of time, not just visited briefly. The arrangement of stones suggests astronomical function, but also social function. These were gathering places, ceremonial centres, places where knowledge was shared and transmitted. Nabta Playa is older than Stonehenge by more than 2,000 years. Stonehenge, that most famous of all ancient astronomical sites, was constructed around 3000 BCE. Nabta Playa's astronomical alignments predated it by 4,000 years. Yet Stonehenge is known throughout the world. Nabta Playa is known primarily to specialists. This disparity is partly geographic. Stonehenge is in Europe, accessible to European scholars, written about in European languages. Nabta Playa is in the Egyptian Sahara, remote, difficult to access. But the disparity also reflects something more troubling, a bias in how we credit knowledge and achievement. When Europeans build stone circles aligned to the stars, we call it sophisticated astronomy. When Africans build stone circles aligned to the stars, we overlook it. We dismiss it. We assume it must be ceremonial but not scientific. This challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about the birth of civilization. We've long been told that civilization began in the Nile Valley, that the Nile River, with its predictable flooding patterns, allowed ancient Egyptians to develop agriculture, writing, complex society, and monumental architecture, that the river was the cradle of civilization in Africa and perhaps the world. But Nabta Playa suggests something different. It suggests that sophisticated knowledge, astronomical, mathematical, organizational, existed in the Sahara long before the Nile Valley civilizations reached their heights. It suggests that the people of the Sahara weren't primitive or backward. They were observers of the sky. They were engineers of landscapes. They were capable of coordinating large groups to create monuments of stone. They understood the cosmos in ways that would later be attributed exclusively to ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians. Consider the implication. If sophisticated astronomical knowledge existed in the Sahara at 7000 BCE, what does that say about the origins of human civilization? We've spent centuries telling a narrative where civilization emerged from river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. But what if we've had the story backward? What if the Sahara, at a time when it was green and wet, was where complex human societies first developed? What if the knowledge, the skills, the organizational structures that later built the pyramids and the ziggurats didn't originate in river valleys at all, but in the Sahara? What if the people who migrated to the Nile Valley brought with them knowledge that their Saharan ancestors had accumulated over millennia? This is speculative, but it's not wild speculation. It's speculation grounded in evidence. The evidence of Nabta Playa, the evidence of the Garamantes, the evidence of the trade networks and the water systems and the settlements spread across what we thought was empty desert. The evidence that satellites have revealed layer by layer, year by year as technology has improved. The discovery of Nabta Playa and its astronomical alignments is a reminder of something that satellite archaeology and modern remote sensing keep revealing again and again. We've been wrong about the Sahara. We've dismissed it as empty. We've treated it as a dead space between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. We've assumed that civilization happened elsewhere, in river valleys, in tropical regions, in places where water was abundant. But the evidence, both from satellites and from archaeology, tells a different story. The Sahara was home to empires. It was home to trade networks that moved goods across thousands of miles. It was home to people who understood water management so well that they could thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It was home to astronomers who tracked the stars and built monuments aligned to the heavens. It was home to cultures that endured for thousands of years. It was a place where the human intellect flourished despite harsh conditions, or perhaps because of them. Perhaps the necessity of surviving in the Sahara, of understanding water systems, of organizing societies to function in extreme conditions, of tracking the stars to create calendars and coordinate activities. Perhaps all of this was what pushed human civilization forward. If you're still awake and enjoying this, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. Now, let's get back to what lies beneath the sand. Because the discoveries we've discussed so far, the cities, the water systems, the trade networks, the astronomical sites, they're only part of the story. There's something else hidden in the Sahara. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about how ancient civilizations rose and fell. But something was changing in the sky. Something that no one could see, but everyone would feel. Around 5,500 years ago, the Earth's orbital wobble began to shift again. Just as it had tilted the monsoons northward thousands of years before, bringing rain to the Sahara, creating that green paradise we explored earlier. Now it tilted them back. The rains didn't stop immediately. That's what's so heartbreaking about this story. They didn't stop all at once. They stopped slowly, year by year, decade by decade. The people of the Green Sahara watched their world die in slow motion. And that slow motion made it perhaps even worse than a sudden catastrophe. Because slow means there's always hope. There's always the thought that maybe next year will be different. Imagine you're standing there. Your grandmother tells you stories of lakes so deep you couldn't see the bottom, of rains that came every summer without fail, so heavy you had to shout to be heard, of a landscape so thick with game that hunters could bring down what they needed within hours of leaving the village. Your mother remembers when the rivers ran thick and constant, when you could cross them on the backs of your cattle without water reaching their shoulders. She remembers the wet smell in the air during the monsoon season, that thick, heavy humidity that made everything green and made everything grow. Your father watched the river get thinner. He remembers the last time it flooded like it used to. He remembers the exact year because he was coming of age, because it was the last great flood, and after that, each year brought a little less water. You stand at what remains of the water's edge, and you're watching the lake shrink. Year after year, it shrinks. The shoreline creeps inward, leaving behind a ring of bleached bones, fish bones, cattle bones, the bones of animals that came to drink and found no water. Dead fish lie in the mud that's turning to dust. The green reeds that used to cover the banks are gone. Now there's just dust, and the dust tastes like loss. And it continues. The rains come, but not as much. The rains come, but not as often. Some years they don't come at all. You plant your crops and you wait, and the sky stays blue and the heat beats down and the plants wilt before they mature. The grass that once stretched to the horizon begins to thin. Suddenly you can see the ground beneath it. The trees that provided shade and fruit start to stress. Their leaves turn brown earlier in the season. They drop their fruit before it's ripe because they don't have the water to feed it. Deep-rooted acacias hold on longer than anything else, but even they begin to lose the battle. Their branches bare themselves. Their trunks split from the stress. The grasslands become scrubland. The scrubland becomes scattered shrubs. And then, slowly, it becomes sand. And then it becomes nothing. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, though some parts of it happened faster than others. There was no year where everything turned to desert overnight. But there was a turning point. There was a moment, perhaps spread across a century, perhaps compressed into a generation, where people realized something fundamental had changed. The rains weren't coming back. The water wasn't returning. This wasn't a temporary dry spell. This wasn't the kind of challenge that could be overcome with traditional knowledge or ancestral practices. This was permanent. And that realization, that shift from hope to acceptance to desperation, that's where the real collapse began. The archaeological record shows us what happened next. We can read it in the bones of animals, in the pollen trapped in ancient sediments, in the patterns of human settlement. We can read it in the sudden abandonment of cities that had been occupied for generations. We can read it in the tools left behind, the pottery, the evidence of life cut short. The people began to move, not in panic. Well, maybe some of it was panic, but not all at once. Steadily, inevitably, like water following the slope of the land, the population of the Sahara began flowing toward the remaining water sources, the great lakes and rivers that still held life, the Nile Valley, Lake Chad, the Niger River. These became the gathering places of humanity. These became the last refugees of a civilization that had spanned a continent. Think about this migration on a human scale for a moment. A family packing what they could carry, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The animals that had sustained them for generations. Could they walk the distance? Could the children? The elderly? How many didn't make it? How many became lost in the expanding dunes? How many died of thirst in the growing gaps between water sources? How many got as far as the Nile and found it already crowded with other refugees? The social structures that had held their societies together began to break down. Communities that had been stable for thousands of years fragmented. People who had been neighbours for generations became strangers, or worse, competitors for scarce water. This migration, and we're talking about millions of people spread across centuries, this migration may have triggered one of the most important transformations in human history. It may have directly caused the rise of Egyptian civilization. This is one of those moments where human history hinges on an environmental change, where the destiny of entire civilizations depends on the movement of monsoon patterns thousands of miles away, where the future of the world was shaped by the drying of the Sahara. Think about what was happening in the Nile Valley during this period. Here was a river that had always had water, a river that flooded predictably every year, depositing rich silt that made the land incredibly fertile. A narrow ribbon of black soil, they would come to call it. But the Nile Valley was a narrow ribbon of life in an enormous wasteland. Its population was small, spread out, living in simple communities. They had basic agriculture, enough to sustain themselves with some surplus for trade. They had basic social organization, clan structures, local leadership. But they were not yet a civilization. They had not yet developed the complex centralized systems that would allow millions of people to live together, to coordinate labor on massive projects, to organize themselves into hierarchies and bureaucracies. But then millions of people began arriving from the west. Saharan pastoralists with deep knowledge of how to manage large herds of cattle. People with complex social systems already in place. They had organized their societies across vast distances, coordinating seasonal migrations, managing shared resources. People with knowledge of how to organize water resources, knowledge gained from living in a landscape where water was precious and competition for it was intense. People who had been studying the stars for thousands of years, using astronomy for religious and agricultural purposes. The same people whose ancestors had built Nabta Playa, whose knowledge was written in stone. People who carried with them the cultural memory of a vast, thriving civilization that had just been lost. They brought their tools, they brought their techniques, they brought their gods, they brought their ways of thinking about the world. When these populations mixed with the inhabitants of the Nile Valley, when their knowledge and social structures and technological know-how were combined with the fertile floodplains, something extraordinary happened. The seeds of Egyptian civilization were planted. The newcomers from the Sahara brought the organizational knowledge, the astronomical knowledge, the spiritual frameworks. The Nile Valley provided the abundance, the water, the fertile soil, the food surplus needed to support a growing population. Together, they created something that had never existed before. The evidence is written in the early dynasties. Look at the cattle cult that was so central to early Egyptian religion. Look at how cattle were depicted in art, revered in religious texts, the spiritual importance placed on them. This isn't something that emerged naturally from the Nile Valley's river-focused agriculture. A river civilization would naturally have a cult of the water, the fish, the fertility of the floods. But cattle, this is something that comes directly from the pastoralist traditions of the Sahara. The cattle were sacred because for thousands of years they had been the foundation of life in the green grasslands to the west. They had been wealth itself. They had been food and transportation and connection to the gods. And the Egyptians inherited this reverence, this spiritual connection to cattle, from the people who arrived from the dying Sahara. Look at early Egyptian astronomy. The Decan system, the 36 stars that Egyptians used to divide the night sky and mark the passage of time. The sophisticated ways they observed and recorded the stars, tracked their movements, used them to determine seasons and plan agricultural cycles. This wasn't invented in the Nile Valley. This knowledge came from the Sahara. Remember Nabta Playa, those stone alignments that marked the rising of stars that created a calendar written in stone. Those practices predated Egyptian astronomy by thousands of years. The Egyptians didn't independently develop this knowledge. They inherited it. They learned it from the people who had crossed the desert and brought their accumulated knowledge with them. The stones of Nabta Playa taught the Egyptians how to read the sky. The calendar itself, the Egyptian calendar that divided the year into 30-day months, that was designed to track the inundation of the Nile and the movements of the stars. There's strong evidence that this calendar originated with Saharan pastoralists, adapted to track the seasons and the movements of their herds, and then brought to the Nile where it was refined and formalized. It became the basis for all Egyptian timekeeping, for organizing labor, for planning the cycles of agriculture and ritual. A calendar born in the Sahara became the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. So when we think about the birth of Egyptian civilization, one of the first great civilizations in human history, the civilization that gave the world the pyramids, the civilization whose influence echoes through Western culture even today, we need to understand that it didn't emerge in isolation. It wasn't purely an invention of the Nile Valley. It emerged from a collision, a mixing of populations, a convergence of knowledge systems. Egyptian civilization may owe its origins not to the Nile but to the Sahara, not to the river but to the desert, not to the people who had always lived there but to the refugees from a lost world. The desertification of the Sahara created the conditions for one of the world's greatest civilizations. Meanwhile, back in the Sahara itself, the transformation was accelerating. The drying wasn't just slow and gradual anymore. There's a tipping point in these environmental collapses. As the lakes shrank and the vegetation died, the landscape itself changed in ways that accelerated the process. Less vegetation meant less water returned to the atmosphere through plant transpiration. Less vegetation meant more exposed soil and sand, which absorbed less water and reflected more heat back into the atmosphere. The desert was feeding itself, becoming denser, becoming more extreme. The climate system entered a feedback loop where desertification bred more desertification, where the loss of vegetation made the area even more hostile to vegetation. A vicious cycle that spread across the continent like a stain spreading through water, and the sand dunes were advancing. You have to understand what this means visually, physically. The sand doesn't just spread evenly across the landscape like a blanket being unrolled. It comes in waves of dunes that can be hundreds of feet tall, moving across the landscape like frozen waves in a sea of sand. These dunes don't stay still. They advance, they migrate, and they bury everything in their path. They buried roads that had connected communities, roads that had been established for generations, roads that people had walked for centuries. They buried farms that had fed thousands, fields where crops had grown year after year, where people had worked the soil their ancestors had worked. They buried graveyards where the ancestors were resting, tombs and cairns that had been built to preserve the memory of the dead. They buried the cities that had once housed tens of thousands of people, markets where traders gathered, temples where priests conducted rituals, homes where families had lived their lives. Some of these buried cities, some of the ones that archaeologists have found beneath the sand using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, show evidence of very sudden abandonment. Houses left with possessions still inside, pottery in various states of completion, tools lying on the ground as if dropped in haste, children's toys, jewellery, food storage vessels still containing the remains of stored grain. And then nothing. The sand came, and it came fast enough that people didn't even have time to collect everything they owned. They didn't have time to carefully pack what was most important. They didn't have time to say goodbye to places their ancestors had lived. They grabbed what they could carry, and they left, or they died trying. Within a few hundred years, the transformation was complete. The Green Sahara was gone, not as a memory that faded slowly over generations, but as a visible reality that vanished. Where there had been lakes, there was now sand. Where there had been cities, there was now dunes. Where there had been grasslands stretching to the horizon, there was now rock and sand and heat and emptiness. The people who had lived there for thousands of years were scattered. Some had made it to the Nile, to Lake Chad, to the Niger. Some had established new communities in these new lands, mixed with the existing populations, become the founders of new civilizations. Others died along the way. Others simply disappeared into history. Their bones now lie beneath the sand, their stories lost, their names forgotten. The Sahara became what it is today, the world's largest hot desert. 3.6 million square miles. That's larger than the continental United States, larger than all of Western Europe, a landscape so vast and so extreme that it seems impossible that anything could ever have lived there. The temperatures soar to over 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the deepest parts. The rainfall, where it falls at all, amounts to mere inches per year. The wind blows constantly, moving sand grain by grain, sculpting massive dunes, eroding rock into stone pillars and natural monuments. And yet, 10,000 years ago, this was one of the most vibrant, most populated, most culturally sophisticated regions in the world. It was a place where humans thrived, where civilizations rose, where knowledge accumulated and was transmitted across generations. It was a place where people looked up at the stars and understood them, where they built monuments that lasted thousands of years, where they created art and music and stories. And then it all vanished beneath the sand. Let me pause here for a moment because I want to emphasize something important. This wasn't a failure of the people who lived in the Green Sahara. They didn't collapse. because they were somehow less advanced or less capable than other civilizations. They didn't fail because they lacked the knowledge or the tools or the strength to survive. They faced an environmental change on an enormous scale, one driven by forces beyond their control, by the orbital mechanics of the Earth itself, changes in solar insolation, in atmospheric circulation patterns, in the behavior of monsoon systems. These are things no human society, no matter how advanced, could have prevented or stopped. They responded as humans have always responded to environmental catastrophe. They adapted, they migrated, they innovated, they survived. Some of them went on to build one of history's greatest civilizations. That's not failure, that's resilience. That's the human capacity to endure, to change, to transform themselves in response to an unforgiving world. And the place where this happened, the place where their cities stood, where their lakes reflected the stars, where their cattle grazed on endless grasslands, that place still exists in the ground, under the sand, under the dunes, waiting. The cities are still there, the bones are still there, the artifacts are still there, the memory is still there, encoded in the earth, waiting to be discovered. Each year, new technologies allow us to see what's beneath the sand. Satellites with specialized sensors, ground-penetrating radar, advanced dating techniques, and each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of what was lost and what was learned. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, where were we? The stars are still there. Above the Sahara, the same stars shine that shone 10,000 years ago, the same constellations, the same celestial patterns, the stars that the people of the Green Sahara watched, studied and worshipped. The sky hasn't changed, even though everything beneath it has. The wind moves across the empty dunes. It carries the sound of nothing, the silence of a place where millions once lived. It moves the sand grain by grain, slowly erasing the last traces of what was here. The dunes shift and change, but they don't reveal what's beneath them. The cities stay buried. The stories stay hidden, unless we go looking for them. Or do they? Because we've found them. We're finding them. Every year, new discoveries. New cities emerging from beneath the sand as the dunes move and shift. New evidence of how vast this civilization was, how complex, how connected. Every year, new technologies let us see more clearly. Satellites that can see beneath the sand, radar that can penetrate the dunes, sonar that can detect the echoes of ancient waterways. And the evidence we're finding is rewriting our understanding of human history. The Green Sahara wasn't just a fascinating relic of a wetter past. It wasn't just a historical curiosity, a footnote in the story of human civilization. It was a civilization in its own right. It was a world that shaped the world we know today. Its collapse and the migration of its people created the conditions for the rise of Egyptian civilization. Its knowledge, astronomical, organizational, spiritual, became embedded in one of history's greatest societies. It was not forgotten. It was transformed. It persisted, even after its landscape disappeared beneath the sand. And as we stand at the edge of another great environmental change, as we watch our own climate shifting, our own world transforming, as we grapple with questions about how to adapt to a changing planet, perhaps the story of the Green Sahara has something to teach us. Perhaps it reminds us that the world is not static, that landscapes change, that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems permanent, a great river, a vast grassland, a thriving culture, can vanish. But that vanishing doesn't mean ending. It means transformation. It means adaptation. It means that the knowledge and the skills and the resilience of a people can persist even when their homeland disappears. The silence of the Sahara holds these stories. The sand keeps them. And the stars above, they remember everything. They're still watching, still shining, just as they did 10,000 years ago, just as they will do 10,000 years from now. As sleep begins to take you deeper, imagine yourself standing at the edge of one of those ancient lakes. The water is still there in your mind. The surface is calm and still. The stars are reflected perfectly in its surface, not distorted, not scattered, but whole and complete. The air is warm. The night is peaceful. The world is green again, if only in your dreams. You can hear the sound of life around you. Animals in the distance, the rustle of wind through grass, maybe even voices, the sounds of human settlement, The world is alive again, and as you stand there, at that edge between water and land, between past and present, let yourself drift deeper into peace. Let the warmth of that distant lake wrap around you. Let the stars reflect their ancient light into your mind. But there's more to uncover, more ruins beneath the sand, more evidence of what was lost and what was learned, more connections between the ancient world and the modern one, more stories waiting to be told. And as we prepare to explore what came next, how this ancient knowledge influenced the civilizations that followed, how the refugees from the Green Sahara shaped the course of human history, and what the modern world has discovered about these lost cities through technology and archaeology, let that thought gently drift away from your conscious mind. Let it settle into the deeper layers of sleep. Let yourself sink deeper into rest, knowing that tomorrow there will be more to learn, more mysteries to explore, more stories to uncover. But for now, sleep. Let sleep take you. And so, as we stand here in the present moment, the Sahara continues to reveal its secrets. The desert is not silent about its past. Every year, new discoveries emerge from beneath the sand, each one a quiet testament to the billions of grains that have spent millennia protecting the remnants of human civilization. Satellite imagery, the kind we can observe from the comfort of our homes, has become an archaeological tool of profound sensitivity. Scientists scan the dunes with infrared cameras and radar that can see through layers of sand, and what they find astonishes them. Entire settlements, hidden for 10,000 years, begin to emerge as faint outlines in the data. Geometric patterns that could only be human structures. Places where people lived, where children played, where elders sat in the evenings and watched the stars turn overhead. New sites are discovered each year now, quietly expanding our understanding of that ancient world. Some researchers estimate that the ruins they have found represent perhaps only a fraction of what lies beneath the sand, that there are countless more settlements and structures waiting to be discovered, waiting for the technologies of the future to render them visible. The Sahara, you see, is a kind of time capsule that works in reverse. Instead of freezing things suddenly like ice, the desert preserves through a gentle, patient process. Sand is a protective medium. It shields objects from the elements, from oxygen, from the degrading forces that wear away at human history. When archaeologists dig into these sand-preserved sites, they find pottery that still bears the fingerprints of the people who moulded it, those tiny whirls of skin pressed into clay that hardened into permanence. They find tools with handles that have survived intact for millennia, wood that would have turned to dust in a wetter climate still holding its grain and its shape. They find bones that tell stories of diet and health and migration, teeth worn down from grinding grain or tearing meat, fractures that healed or did not heal, the physical evidence of lives lived in particular ways. They find buildings whose walls still stand, whose rooms still echo with the absence of the voices that once filled them. Even more intimate artifacts emerge, shells that were fashioned into ornaments and worn around the neck or wrist as symbols of status or spiritual protection, ochre pigments ground for paint or for marking the body in rituals we can only speculate about, stone vessels that held water in a time when water was life itself, so precious that it shaped every decision and every movement of daily existence. The Sahara preserves everything because it is so dry, so sterile, so utterly inhospitable to the bacteria and fungi that normally break down organic material. The microbes that would feast on bone and wood and plant fibre in a humid climate cannot survive in the Sahara's desiccating embrace. What was buried in sand 10,000 years ago remains almost exactly as it was left behind, frozen not in ice but in dryness, sealed not by cold but by heat and the absolute absence of moisture. Even textiles sometimes survive in Saharan contexts, fragments of cloth that were woven by hand and worn against the skin, so rare in the archaeological record that they are treasured beyond measure. Every fibre, every knot tells a story of manufacturing technique, of the time invested, of the value placed on clothing in a world where protection from the sun and heat was literally a matter of survival. This preservation has allowed us to understand the texture of ancient Saharan life in ways that would otherwise remain forever unknown. We know what they cooked and how they cooked it. The charred remains of meals still sitting in cooking pots, as if the cook had only stepped away moments ago, not 10 millennia. We know what animals they hunted and what plants they gathered, the bones and seeds creating a record of diet that anthropologists can analyse for nutrition and seasonal patterns of movement. We know how they adorned themselves and what tools they trusted to survive, the objects that were important enough to bury with the dead or to carry through the desert on long migrations. We know something of their spiritual beliefs through the placement of burials, through the objects found with the dead, through the careful attention they paid to ritual and commemoration. The Sahara has become a library written in stone and bone and clay, and every new excavation is a page we read by candlelight, slowly, carefully, with the reverence it deserves. This is not abstract academic knowledge, but rather an intimate understanding of human existence lived under pressure, lived at the edge of survival, lived with grace and creativity despite or perhaps because of the harshness of the environment. But there is another story unfolding in the Sahara, one that reaches from the distant past into the uncertain future, a story written not in archaeological sites, but in climate data, in ice cores and ocean sediments, and the subtle shifts in solar radiation that have characterized Earth's history. The climate of our planet is not stable, despite what our short human lifespans might suggest. The Earth's climate is cyclical, driven by subtle shifts in the planet's orbit, by changes in solar radiation, by the composition of the atmosphere itself. These cycles play out over thousands of years, over tens of thousands of years, over much longer time frames than human civilization has existed. And the Sahara has been green before, not once but multiple times. When you look at the geological record of North Africa, you find evidence of monsoon rains reaching far north of where they reach today. You find evidence of lakes where now there are only dunes, vast inland seas that filled the depressions in the Saharan landscape and supported fish and water birds and human settlements on their shores. You find evidence of forests where now there is only bare rock, of rivers that flowed with water, where now there are only dry riverbeds called wadis that hold water only after rare storms. The Sahara has greened and dried and greened again over hundreds of thousands of years, cycling through states of being that we are only beginning to fully map and understand. In the future, according to climate models that examine long-term patterns, this cycle could repeat itself again. This is not a certainty. Climate prediction remains an inexact science, full of variables and uncertainties and competing models that sometimes reach different conclusions from the same data. But some researchers, studying the long-term cycles of Earth's climate and the patterns of the monsoon systems and the subtle feedback loops that drive precipitation, believe that in future centuries, not next year or next decade, but perhaps 200 or 300 years hence, or perhaps longer still, the monsoon could shift northward again. The rains could return to the Sahara. It is a thought that settles into the mind like the first drops of rain on thirsty ground, a possibility both hopeful and strange. A desert that once supported human civilization could become habitable again, could green again, could support agriculture and settlement and the flowering of human culture. The cities that now lie beneath the sand could rise metaphorically back into relevance, their ruins becoming once again centers of human activity and meaning. It is a reminder that the present state of things is not permanent, that the world is more fluid and changeable than we often imagine, that the transformation from fertile to arid to fertile again is part of the Earth's fundamental rhythm, written into the deep time of geological history. Even more immediately, we can observe signs of this potential transformation already beginning at the present moment, though they are subtle and not uniformly distributed. At the southern edge of the Sahara, in a region called the Sahel, there is a band of land where desert gradually becomes savanna, becomes grassland, a transitional zone where the influence of the Sahara and the influence of wetter regions to the south compete for dominance. This is the frontier where the Sahara fights with greener landscapes for dominance, where rainfall patterns determine whether the land becomes more desert or less. And in recent decades, something unexpected has happened in parts of the Sahel. The land has begun to green again, not dramatically, not uniformly across the entire region, but noticeably enough that it shows up clearly in satellite imagery that tracks vegetation, that measures the chlorophyll content of plants and records how much of the landscape is covered in green growth, shows that in some regions more trees and plants are growing now than did 30 or 40 years ago, a reversal of the desertification trend that had been advancing for decades before. The reason is complex and involves multiple factors: changes in rainfall patterns that are beginning to favour vegetation growth, changes in land management practices that prioritise trees and soil conservation, improved agricultural techniques that preserve moisture, and a massive environmental initiative called the Great Green Wall. The Great Green Wall is one of the world's most ambitious environmental projects, a vision to restore trees and vegetation across the entire width of Africa, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, along the southern edge of the Sahara. It is not a wall in the traditional sense, not a physical barrier you could walk along or see from space, but rather a commitment and a program to plant billions of trees and restore degraded land, to push back against the desert not through conquest but through cultivation. The project was conceived as a response to desertification, to the slow but relentless expansion of the Sahara into fertile land, and to the climate change that drives this process. It represents an understanding that desertification is not inevitable, that human beings can slow it or even reverse it through deliberate effort and long-term investment. And while the project is still young, still incomplete, the results in some areas are already visible. Trees have taken root where none grew before. Farmers have returned to land they thought was lost forever, establishing fields and orchards where the sands seem to reign eternal. The desert has retreated just slightly, in certain places, a small but measurable victory in the ancient conflict between human habitation and environmental limitation. It is a project rooted in the understanding that what happened to the ancient Sahara, the gradual loss of water, the drying of the lakes, the failure of the monsoon, the migration of peoples, the collapse of civilizations, could happen again if we do not tend to the relationships between land and water and climate with intentionality and care. Yet at this very moment, as the Sahel shows signs of recovery in some places, another ancient lake continues its slow death in the present day, a story running parallel to the story of the ancient Sahara but unfolding in real time before our eyes. Lake Chad, the body of water that was once so important to the people who lived around its shores, is still shrinking. The lake that covered an area the size of Belgium in the 1960s, according to satellite data, is now perhaps a tenth of that size. Satellite images tell the story in shades of blue receding from the edges of the map, the waterline moving inward year after year, creating a visual chronicle of loss and transformation. The lake is still there, still holding water, still supporting communities, but it is diminished, fundamentally reduced from what it once was. The people who live around Lake Chad today face challenges that echo the struggles of the ancient Saharans 10,000 years ago with uncanny precision. They watch their water source diminish. They see fishing grounds that sustain them for generations becoming barren and unproductive. They face the question that defines all climate-driven transformations. Do we leave or do we adapt? Do we move or do we find new ways to survive in a place that is becoming less habitable? The shrinking of Lake Chad is driven by multiple factors working together, a complex web of causes that are difficult to separate from one another. Climate change brings less rainfall to the region, reducing the water that flows into the lake from the sky. Irrigation projects draw water from tributary rivers for agriculture, removing water that would have flowed into the lake itself. A growing population, one of the fastest growing in the world, puts greater demands on finite resources, more people needing to drink, more crops needing to be watered, more fish needed to feed hungry mouths. The combination of these factors is devastating, and the lake responds by shrinking, by concentrating what water remains into an ever smaller area. It is not a dramatic collapse like the Saharan monsoon failure 10,000 years ago, sudden and catastrophic, but it is the same process playing out in slow motion, extended across decades and centuries rather than compressed into a few generations. And the communities around Lake Chad are responding with the same combination of pragmatism and resilience that their ancient predecessors displayed when faced with environmental transformation. Some are adapting their agricultural practices, shifting from cattle herding to crops that require less water, exploring new techniques that maximize productivity with minimal moisture. Some are leaving for cities where opportunities exist, joining the migration flows that characterize the modern world, seeking employment in sectors unrelated to agriculture or fishing. Some are finding new ways to sustain themselves in a world that is changing, turning to small-scale trade or tourism or other forms of economic activity that do not depend on the lake's resources. It is a conversation written in real time between humanity and the climate that shapes our lives, between adaptation and movement, and the fundamental human capacity to find ways forward even when the ground beneath our feet is shifting. This is perhaps the most humbling lesson the Sahara has to teach us in the present age. Climate change is not new. Climate catastrophe, in the sense of rapid and overwhelming environmental transformation, is not an unprecedented apocalypse or a modern invention. Civilizations have risen and flourished under climates different from what we experience today, and they have fallen when those climates changed. The ancient Saharans did not cause the monsoon to fail through their own actions. They did not emit greenhouse gases or alter the composition of the atmosphere or deforest the landscape into submission. They were victims of natural cycles, of forces beyond their control, of the deep rhythms of the Earth's climate system. And yet they experienced displacement, loss, migration, the dissolution of entire worlds. They experienced the kind of climate-driven upheaval that we fear today, and they survived it by adapting, by moving, by finding new ways to be human in new environments, by developing new skills and new knowledge systems and new ways of relating to the land. This knowledge should humble us, not paralyze us with despair or overwhelm us with hopelessness, but humble us in the truest sense of the word. The scale of what was lost in the Sahara, the civilizations that thrived for millennia, the knowledge systems they developed and refined through thousands of years, the cities they built with stone and mud and will, the ways of life they perfected and passed down through generations, should remind us that climate change is not merely an abstract threat or a statistical problem, but a force capable of transforming human existence in fundamental ways. The ancient Saharans were not less advanced than us, not less intelligent, not less deserving of the lands they inhabited. They were simply human beings living in a world that changed, and when it did, their old ways no longer worked. The expertise that had served them for generations, the knowledge of where to find water in a wet climate, the agricultural techniques suited to regular rainfall, the social structures organized around permanent settlement and stable resources, became suddenly obsolete, maladapted to a new reality. There is a profound lesson in that realization, one that speaks to us across 10,000 years. The world we have built depends on certain conditions remaining relatively stable, and those conditions are always ultimately temporary. And yet the Sahara is not a story only of loss and abandonment. The people did not simply vanish, did not disappear as if they had never been. They adapted. They migrated. Many of them moved to the Nile and transformed that river valley into the cradle of Egyptian civilization, contributing their knowledge and their skills to something entirely new. But others stayed. Other peoples came to the Sahara after the ancient cities were abandoned, drawn by trade routes or fleeing their own climate challenges, or simply seeking the harsh freedom that the desert offered. The Tuareg people, the Berbers, the Arabs who crossed the desert on trade routes, the merchants and warriors and poets who made the Sahara their home, they became the keepers of Saharan knowledge. They learned to live in one of Earth's harshest environments, and they maintained a presence there for millennia, creating cultures and traditions and ways of being that are remarkable for their sophistication and their adaptation to extremity. And in the oral traditions of the Tuareg, in the stories they tell and retell around fires in the desert night, in the songs they sing and the poetry they recite, there are echoes of a greener time, stories of when the land was wetter, stories of ancient peoples who inhabited the desert before them, stories that have survived in the human voice, that most ancient and resilient form of storage, what did not survive in the stone and sand. These modern Saharan peoples are remarkable in themselves, worthy of their own deep study and respect. The Tuareg in particular, often called the blue people of the desert for the deep indigo robes they wear, and the way the dye gradually stains their skin over months and years of wearing the cloth, creating a beautiful discoloration that marks them as desert dwellers, have constructed an entire civilization adapted to the harshest conditions imaginable. They are warriors and traders and poets, brilliant navigators and diplomats and artists. They navigate the Sahara as if they were navigating an ocean, reading signs in the sand and the position of stars and the behavior of animals that would be entirely invisible to outsiders. They know where the waterholes are hidden, the secret wells and springs that sustain life in the desert interior. They understand the rhythms of trade and migration and seasonal movement, the intricate knowledge required to move goods and people across hundreds of miles of empty land. They have ancient caravan routes that still exist and are still partially in use today, pathways worn into the desert by centuries of travel, worn into the very skin of the land by the passage of countless camels and merchants and warriors and families, connecting oases and wells and distant markets, creating networks of exchange and communication that bind together the fragments of the Saharan world. These routes are ghosts of ancient trade paths, the same routes that connected the Sahara to the Mediterranean, to sub-Saharan Africa, to the rest of the known world, and they persist even now in an age of motorized vehicles and global shipping. Travellers still use them, though now they are more likely to travel in vehicles than on camels, and yet the routes themselves persist, as if the desert has memory written into its geography, as if the land remembers the billions of footsteps that have crossed it. The Tuareg and other Saharan peoples represent a form of human resilience and adaptation that is itself humbling to contemplate. They have made a home in a place that most would consider uninhabitable, that would kill an unprepared person within days. They have created art and music and poetry in the midst of dunes, traditions of beauty and meaning that transform harsh landscape into homeland. They maintain traditions that stretch back through centuries of oral transmission, knowledge passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child, without written record yet with remarkable fidelity and precision. And they are very likely descendants of the ancient Saharans, the inheritors of bloodlines that fled the drying desert 10,000 years ago, and some branches of which returned or never entirely left. In this sense, the Sahara has never truly lost its people. They simply transform themselves to fit a transformed landscape, evolved new skills and new strategies, new ways of thinking and being that allowed them to thrive where their ancestors had once lived, in green oases beneath regular rains. And the Sahara itself, for all its harshness and its dangers, possesses a terrible and magnificent beauty that takes the breath away. To travel through the desert, or even to contemplate it from afar, is to encounter something vast and humbling, something that diminishes human scale and yet somehow illuminates it. The dunes are sculptural, shaped by wind into forms that resemble waves frozen in sand, or faces carved in profile, or abstract expressions of forces too large to fully comprehend. The colour of the sand shifts with the light, with the angle of the sun and the composition of the minerals, golden in the morning when the light is low, almost white at noon when the sun is directly overhead, deep orange and red in the late afternoon when long shadows create depth and dimension. The horizon is impossibly distant, a line that seems to extend beyond the curvature of the earth itself, vanishing into a haze where sand and sky seem to merge into a single, undifferentiated blue. And the sky above is enormous, a dome of blue or grey or, when storms approach, a roiling chaos of cloud and wind and dust that moves across the landscape with terrible beauty. But it is at night that the Sahara reveals something truly transcendent, something that touches the deepest parts of human consciousness and spirituality. As the sun drops below the horizon, sinking slowly at first and then with increasing speed, the heat that has dominated the day begins to dissipate with remarkable quickness. The sand cools beneath your feet, the air shifts and changes, and the temperature plummets in a way that might seem contradictory in such a harsh and hot environment that seems to defy the logic of a place defined by its aridity and heat, but which is actually a fundamental characteristic of deserts everywhere. The thin, dry air that allows the heat to accumulate and intensify during the day also allows it to radiate back into space at night, unimpeded by the moisture and cloud cover that slows heat loss in humid climates. Within a few hours of sunset, the Sahara becomes cold, genuinely cold, cold enough that people need blankets and seek warmth. People huddle in blankets and gather around fires for both light and heat, drawing close to one another and to the flames. And then, as the last light drains from the sky, as the blue of twilight deepens through purple into black, something emerges that takes the breath away and stops the mind in its tracks. The stars come out. Not in the tentative way that stars emerge in a city or even in a moderately dark location, where you have to look carefully and can see only the brightest few, but in a profusion so overwhelming that it is almost difficult to comprehend. The numbers are so great that the mind cannot count them. The Milky Way arches across the sky in a great river of light, so bright and so detailed that it casts shadows on the ground, that you can see colours within it, that the sheer density of stars creates a visual impression almost like fog or luminous gas. Individual stars are innumerable, each one a sun with its own planets and possibilities. The constellations that we know from city skies are only the brightest stars among many, many others, a tiny fraction of the total visible, like seeing a few bright beads in a vast quantity of jewels. The darkness between the stars seems to recede, revealing depth and distance and an overwhelming sense of cosmic scale, making clear in a visceral way what we only know intellectually. that our planet is a small place in an enormous universe. This is the sky that the ancient Saharans looked up at on countless nights after their work was done and their families had gathered around fires like fires tonight. This is the same celestial display that has wheeled above the desert for billions of years, unchanged in its fundamentals even as the land below has transformed again and again from green to brown and back again, even as humans have come and gone and civilizations have risen and fallen. To stand under such a sky and contemplate the vast history of the Sahara is to feel very small indeed. But small does not mean insignificant. The ancient Saharans, looking up at this same sky, built cities and created art and developed knowledge systems. They were small in cosmic terms, small in the face of the vast indifference of the universe, and yet they mattered. They shaped the world around them. They created meaning and beauty and connection in the midst of their short lives. And then they migrated, and the cities fell, and the desert reclaimed them, and now we look at the ruins they left behind and try to understand who they were and what their lives meant. We are engaged in an act of remembrance across 10,000 years, an act of honouring lives we will never fully know, an act of bearing witness to the human capacity for building and creating, even in the harshest circumstances. And we do this while standing beneath the same stars they stood beneath, in a world that continues to change, that will continue to green and dry and transform in ways we cannot predict. The desert at night holds a silence that is almost complete, though not empty. Not the silence of an absence of sound, but a silence so profound that individual sounds become magnified and clear. The whisper of wind across sand, a sound almost like breathing, almost like the desert itself breathing. The distant call of a night animal, a creature adapted to darkness and coolness, hunting or communicating with others of its kind. The crackle of a fire, the pop of burning wood, the release of energy in small distinct sounds, the soft breathing of sleeping people nearby, the human sound that grounds us in the present moment and in our shared mortality. These sounds are not an interruption of the silence, but rather the texture of it, the way the silence actually manifests in a place where human noise does not dominate, where the ambient sound level is so low that the world's actual sounds become audible. It is a silence that modern people rarely experience, particularly those of us who live in cities or towns where there is always some level of noise in the background. When modern people encounter such profound quiet, it often has a quality of revelation, of encounter with something almost sacred. It reminds us that we are not accustomed to such quietness, that our normal auditory environment is filled with mechanical sounds, the hum of motors, the beeping of devices, the constant background noise of civilization. Here in the desert at night, all of that falls away, and we are left with the primary sounds, the sounds that have existed for millions of years. And as you lie there, wrapped in blankets or sitting by a fire, your breath gradually slowing, your mind beginning to ease towards sleep, your eyes adjusting to the darkness and then to the overwhelming light of the stars, you begin to understand what it might have felt like to live in the ancient Sahara. Not the difficulty of the heat, not the hunger or the scarcity or the constant struggle for water, but something of the spiritual and intellectual experience of it, the grandeur, the connection to something much larger than yourself, the awareness that you are very small but also very much a part of a vast and ancient story, the knowledge that the land beneath you and the sky above you and the water you desperately need are all ultimately beyond your control, yet you must live with grace and courage in relationship to them anyway. This is the gift that the Sahara offers in the darkness. When the stars emerge and the temperature drops and the rush of the modern world fades into insignificance, when you are left alone with the simple facts of existence, breath, warmth, thirst, the desire to understand, the need for connection, as we prepare to move toward the final section of our journey, toward the conclusions that tie together all that we have explored and the implications that radiate forward into the future, hold this image in your mind. The desert at night, the stars overhead, countless beyond counting. The profound silence, textured with small sounds. The knowledge that civilizations have risen and fallen across this landscape, that ancient peoples once thrived here in ways we are only beginning to understand, that the land itself is always transforming, always cycling between states of being that we can barely predict or control. The understanding that climate has shaped human history and will continue to shape it, and that the solutions to the challenges we face today may come from understanding how the people of the past adapted to their own transformations. In the next and final section, we will bring together the threads of this story and discover what the lost city beneath the Sahara has to teach us about who we are and who we might become, about resilience and adaptation and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And so we arrive here, at the end of a journey that spans not just time, but the deepest wells of human curiosity and wonder. The Green Sahara is gone now, buried beneath millennia of sand and silence. And yet, it remains with us in so many ways. It remains in the stories we have uncovered together, in the art that still speaks across 10,000 years, in the bones and blood and breath of people whose descendants walk the earth today. It remains, most of all, in what it teaches us about the nature of the world we live in and the nature of existence itself. Nothing is permanent. The driest place on earth, the place where water is so precious that a single well can sustain a community for generations, was once green. It was once alive with rivers and lakes and grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was once a place where antelope grazed beneath acacia trees, where children played in the cool shade near water sources, where hunters could find game within a day's journey in any direction. And then it changed. The rains moved, the climate shifted, the green became gradually, relentlessly less green, until finally the great transformation was complete, and the Sahara became what we know it as today. A desert, vast and beautiful and harsh, a place of extremes, a place where life persists, but only for those hardy enough, clever enough, desperate enough to make it work. For centuries, we looked at this desert and we saw emptiness. We saw nothing. We drew maps of it and we marked vast spaces as empty space. We walked across it and we felt alone. We studied it and we learned the names of its dunes, the patterns of its winds, the brutal efficiency of its heat. But we were wrong. We were so profoundly wrong. Beneath our feet, beneath the sand that shifted and blew and covered everything, an entire world was waiting. Not just one city, not just one civilization, but a complex society. A place where art was made, where families gathered, where stories were told by firelight, where children were born and grew up and had children of their own, where people experienced joy and sorrow, love and loss, hope and fear, just as we do. Just as you do, lying there in the darkness, listening to these words as they drift toward you like the shifting sands themselves. Beneath the emptiness that we thought we saw, life had flourished. That is the humility of it. That is what should make us pause and wonder about all the things we think we understand, all the empty spaces we look at and assume we know the truth about. Perhaps there is more there than we realize. Perhaps the world is fuller and richer, and more full of hidden wonders than our eyes can see. And there is something beautiful, something almost sacred, about the cyclical nature of the Sahara. It has greened and dried many times over the long history of the earth. The climate shifts, the monsoons move, the planet breathes in and out, and the Sahara responds. It expands, it contracts, it transforms itself. And through all of these transformations, life persists. It adapts, it changes, it migrates to new places where water can be found. And then, when the climate shifts again, it returns. Nothing is truly lost. The potential for life to flourish is always there, waiting in the seeds and in the soil and in the memory of the earth itself. Life finds a way. It always does. It flows like water, seeking the spaces where it can exist, making homes in the most unlikely places, persisting through conditions that seem utterly impossible. And then, when the world changes again, it blooms. The cycles continue. The seasons turn. The desert dreams of being green again, and somewhere deep beneath the sand, in the code of plants and animals and microorganisms, that dream remains alive. The people who lived in the Green Sahara are gone now, all of them. Not a single one of them remains on this earth. Their voices are silent. Their footsteps have been erased by time and wind and the turning of seasons beyond counting. And yet they are not truly gone, not completely. They loved. They loved their children and their families and the places they lived. They raised those children in the shade of trees that no longer exist, near waters that have long since disappeared. They watched the stars in that vast desert sky, and they tried to understand the meanings written in those stars just as we do. They told stories by firelight. They made art. They carved images into rocks that would survive for 10,000 years, waiting for other humans to find them and wonder about the hands that made them. They made pottery and hunted and gathered and built homes and communities. They experienced all the things that make us human: the hunger and the satisfaction of eating, the cold of night and the warmth of fire, the pain of loss and the joy of connection. They are gone, yes, but their traces remain scattered across the landscape like seeds, the rock art that speaks to us across the millennia, the pottery that was shaped by human hands and baked in fires that burned long ago, the DNA that runs through the veins of their descendants, the people who live in the Sahara today and in Africa and across the world, carrying within them the genetic legacy of those ancient people, the minerals and nutrients in the soil that were enriched by their presence, by their decomposition, by the slow recycling of life back into the earth. This is what connects us to them, and what connects all of us to all the people who came before. Stretching back through time, we are made of the same atoms. We are animated by the same force that moved them. We live and we breathe and we experience consciousness, and then we do not. And in the space between, we touch the world. We leave traces. We change things. We affect the people around us and the places we inhabit. And perhaps, thousands of years from now, people will uncover some small part of what we left behind and wonder about our lives. They will find artifacts that we left, and they will try to imagine what our hands were like, what we thought about, what we loved. But now, as we sit here together in this moment, it is time to let these thoughts slow down. It is time to let your breathing become steady and calm. It is time to feel your body relaxing into whatever surface you're resting upon. Your pillow soft beneath your head, your blanket warm across your body, the bed holding you gently in its embrace. These are the things that matter now. Not the vast sweep of history, though it is beautiful and worth contemplating, but the warmth of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the safety and comfort of your bed, the simple, profound comfort of having a place to rest, of being allowed to rest, of being able to close your eyes and let go of the day, knowing that you are safe, that you're cared for, that your body and mind deserve this restoration. You too are part of the cycle, you know, just as the Sahara cycles between green and dry, just as civilizations rise and flourish and are buried beneath the sands of time. You cycle too. You wake. You move through the world. You experience, you create, you interact with the people around you, and then you sleep. You return to yourself. You restore yourself. The world continues to turn while you rest. The earth keeps spinning. The stars keep shining. And you, tucked beneath your blanket, are part of that eternal turning. Part of that rhythm that has sustained all life on this planet since the very beginning. Wake and sleep. Wake and sleep. Wake. The eternal cycle that your body understands so deeply, so completely, that you don't even have to think about it. It simply happens. Your eyes grow heavy. Your breathing slows. Your thoughts become softer and less defined. And you drift. You drift towards sleep, toward rest, toward the restoration that you need and deserve. The desert at night is one of the most peaceful places on earth. The heat of the day dissipates. The harsh light softens into starlight. The wind dies down. The sand becomes cool beneath your feet. The darkness arrives like a gentle hand, covering everything, quieting everything, wrapping the world in silence and stillness. There is a kind of peace in that darkness that is hard to find anywhere else. It is vast. It is empty in the way that emptiness can be full of meaning. It is quiet in a way that makes all the noise of the day seem far away and unimportant. The darkness of the desert at night is restorative. It is healing. It allows all things to rest and recover and remember themselves, and that darkness is very much like the darkness of sleep. Like the darkness behind your eyelids right now as they grow heavier and heavier. Like the darkness that welcomes you as you let go of your awareness and sink deeper and deeper into the restful state, where your mind and body can heal themselves. Somewhere beneath those desert sands there is an ancient city. It has been sleeping for 10,000 years. Its streets are quiet. Its homes are empty except for the sand that has drifted in through windows and doors. Its wells are dry. But perhaps in some way we cannot quite measure or understand, it is content. It has completed its purpose. It has lived. It has been home to families and communities and whole generations of human beings. It has contributed to the vast story of human civilization. And now it rests. It sleeps beneath the earth, waiting patiently for the day when perhaps the climate will shift again, and the rains will return, and the desert will transform once more. Until that day comes, it rests. It is still. It is silent. It is at peace. And you, listening to these words, you can rest too. You can let yourself sink into the same kind of peace that settles over the desert when night arrives. You can let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. You can feel the coolness of your pillow against your skin. You can feel the weight of your blanket keeping you safe and warm. You can let your muscles relax one by one, each one loosening and softening as you exhale slowly, gently, peacefully. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The world will continue on without you for the next several hours, and that is perfectly fine. That is exactly as it should be. Your only job right now is to rest. Your only task is to allow yourself to drift towards sleep, to let the day fade away like the light at sunset, to sink deeper and deeper into the darkness of your own peaceful sleep. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. Thank you for letting me be part of your night, part of your ritual of rest and restoration. If this video helped you relax tonight, if it brought you any peace or sense of wonder, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to the Calm Archive. Subscribe so you never miss a new video. I upload regularly every week, and there is always something new to drift off to. New stories, new places, new histories, new civilizations, new reasons to let your mind wander as your body settles into sleep. And if you're willing, tell me in the comments, what lost civilization fascinates you the most? Which ancient people do you wonder about? Which buried city would you like to explore? I read every comment, and I love hearing what captures your imagination and your curiosity. And now, as we come to the very end of this journey together, let me leave you with this final image. Picture it in your mind as clearly as you can. The desert at night. The vast Sahara stretching out beneath a sky so full of stars that there seems to be more light in the stars than in the darkness. The sand is cool now. The wind has stilled. The only sound is the gentlest whisper of a breeze moving across the dunes, and perhaps, if you listen very carefully, the sound of your own breathing, steady and calm and full. The ancient city lies beneath the sand. Its stones are resting, its streets are quiet. The families who lived there, the hunters and the gatherers and the artists and the children and the elders, they are sleeping too. They have been sleeping for 10,000 years beneath the earth. And you, here in this moment, in this place of safety and comfort, you are also allowed to sleep. You are allowed to rest. You can let your eyes close. You can let your awareness fade like the light at the end of day. You can sink into the sand of sleep, warm and dark and utterly peaceful. The desert is sleeping. The ancient city is sleeping. The earth is sleeping its slow, eternal sleep of rotation and seasonal change. And you are sleeping too. You are part of that grand, ancient, beautiful cycle. You are safe. You are warm. You are held by the earth and the darkness and your own body's wisdom. Close your eyes now. Let go. Good night. Sleep well. The Calm Archive will be here when you wake. Archive.